Welcome, everyone. Today is Wednesday, October 6th, 2002, 2002, 2021. Wow, I went back in time. That doesn't sound too bad right now. Anyway, I want to welcome you all today to our Community and Citizen Science in the Far North Conference. It is day 2 for this conference. If you're just joining us today, and this is your first time with us, we want to welcome you, and at a break or so, we'll tell you how to go find presentations that happened yesterday. We won't go into too much about who is on the committee and kind of what the purpose of this conference is, but feel free to ask questions in the chat, and the ARCIS staff will be happy to answer things as we go along. We have a full lineup of presentations. And before we get started with that today, I'm going to turn this over to Roberta Glenn. She's on our steering committee, and she's going to start us off with a land acknowledgement and a hello, and then we'll move into agenda and presentations for the day. And for today's event, just a quick note, you can pop in and out of the event. You don't have to stay for the entire thing as we are recording the presentations. So with that, I'm going to turn this over to Roberta.
Hi, Uvlalot. Good morning, everyone. My name is Roberta Turok Glenn. We just wanted to take a moment to remind everyone to think about the history of the Indigenous people whose land you might be currently living on. While it's becoming standard for people to write down or mention the traditional lands on which we're gathering or where we're zooming in from, like Corey talked about yesterday during this conference, we're looking to push people a step further in that process to look into the history of the Indigenous peoples of that land. So if you're in a more urban city, when and how were the people in that region displaced? For me, I'm currently living in Anchorage, which is the ancestral lands of the Dena'ina people. Corey had a great book recommendation for people who might be interested in learning more about the history of the Dena'ina land. It's called Shem Pete's Alaska, the territory of the Upper Cook Inlet Dena'ina. And I also just wanted to say that I am a UAF graduate student, and that we acknowledge the Alaska Native Nations upon whose ancestral lands our campuses reside. In Fairbanks, our Trothyeta campus is located on the ancestral lands of the Dana people of the lower Tanana River. Puinakpa.
Okay, thank you. And while people are hopefully maybe in chat, introduce yourself and tell us where you're living, and again, maybe recognize the ancestral lands that you are occupying. I am very grateful for also living in Dena'ina region. I live in upper hillside of Anchorage, Alaska, and I have blessed to see the ocean and the mountains. It's a wonderful space to be in. So just to give you an idea of what is coming up today while you're writing in the chat where you're all from, this is just a quick overview of our agenda. Today's, we have several people that will be helping us out through the meeting, like Roberta, and we have Katie Spillman coming up, and I think, and I forgot who's this afternoon, but they're all members of the steering committee and have helped us put together this conference, which has 4 areas of focus. We're focusing on, yesterday we did things that were unique to the Arctic. Today's main focus is people just sharing things that they, projects and activities they are doing. We'll have a open with a keynote speaker. Corey Erickson was online. He's also part of the steering committee, and he has a number of hats that he wears and helps out with ARCIS, but he'll be talking from his newly formed company today, and letting us know about his work and perspective. And then we're going to be moving into 15-minute presentations all the way up until the break, which will be at 10 o'clock Alaska time, and that's 10 o'clock a.m. Alaska time. We'll have a half-hour break, and then after that, we'll come back to the same place and same space, and we'll continue the theme, just sharing. And then we will end the day with a panel discussion. We do have door prizes, so if you didn't join us yesterday, we're doing door prizes just before the break and just before we adjourn for the day. They're just randomly selected participants, and we'll have somebody announce those winners, and then you will get an email from Arcus, from me, or from another person on our staff to talk about what is offered for door prizes. We have 3 companies: Collective 49 with Marketplace, which sells indigenous handicrafts mostly from Alaska, Amazon, and Etsy, which is also more creative kinds of things. And they're $25 gift certificates, and it's just a way to say thank you for joining with us. Then I mentioned that there are 4 themes. Tomorrow we'll cover all about the data and lessons learned. So that's kind of what we're covering today. So I think at this time, I'm going to turn it over to Olivia Lee. She is going to be introducing our keynote speaker today.
Hi, everybody. I'm really pleased to be able to introduce our keynote speaker today, my esteemed colleague, Corey Sikwak Erickson. Corey is the principal and team lead for Ikagun Engagement, which is based in Unalakleet and Anchorage, Alaska. He was raised in the Bering Sea coast and has family scattered across northern Alaska. Sikwak was taught to provide for his communities through subsistence and leadership, to be aware of problems facing Arctic communities, and to find creative, realistic, and effective ways to alleviate or solve those issues. He spent nearly 2 decades immersed in cultural studies and has most recently spent several years developing and implementing creative, effective, and efficient outreach, engagement, and K-12 education programs for high-profile Arctic research projects. Sikwak's unique upbringing and specialized training allows him to successfully fulfill his role as a cultural broker connecting Arctic communities and Arctic research entities. Corey's keynote today will be why it's so hard to solicit buy-in from Arctic communities in Arctic research. Corey, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Olivia. It's a real honor to be here. I will be taking over the sharing screen here. Olivia, it's a real honor to be here. I did want to mention one thing. It might look kind of weird being on the steering committee and also being a keynote, and so I do recognize that and felt a little bit uncomfortable about that, but I think it reflects how small the world is. I had originally applied to do a 15-minute presentation, but on the steering committee, I didn't have anything to do with choosing the keynote. So I really appreciate the organizing committee for asking me to present this today. I did have a little struggle with the subject matter of this presentation because of the awesome day yesterday and the theme today of about sharing. You know, obviously the title of my presentation and the abstract talks a little bit about the challenges that we might face in engaging with communities in the Arctic. And I will also say that I know that we have a big cohort of non-US, non-Canadian researchers. Maybe these issues that I'm talking about maybe also relate in other areas. However, I know that there are a lot of Arctic researchers that that aren't working in areas that have Indigenous communities. So bear with us as we work through this presentation. My name is Corey Sikwak Erickson, and I'm the leader of Ikagun Engagement. And I grew up in various villages on the Bering Straits, and my mom's from Barrow, and I grew up in Unalakleet. So I have family stretched in between there. So before we get into the challenges that we might face, I wanted to share a few of the highlights and some of the positive things that we have to look at regarding community engagement in Arctic research, because I think there's so much to be proud of and so much positive things to look at. Yesterday, I was really enjoyed the presentation on the SIKU project, for instance, and there are so many other examples of the wide realm of community and citizen science and Arctic research. So much to learn from. so many people working so hard to further our fields, I should say. I have noticed as well is that there's a lot of positions opening up, at least in the US side, um, that allow for kind of help in these spaces, what Margaret Rudolph at UAF calls boundary spanners, kind of these spaces to help scientists and communities engage better. You know, the Food Security Working Group, super proud that we've had a few positions that have opened there for Indigenous liaisons. I see that ARPIC and ARCIS have a couple more positions that have opened. ICC has a partnership with ARCIS as well for a data analyst, and that's really cool. And an ACO had done some hiring, and those are just a few examples. I know that across the board in our research institutions, there's a lot of capacity building in that area, or there's attempts to build capacity there, because obviously there's a huge need for help. There's also funding available more and more that I've noticed. Some dear colleague letters through NSF, planning grants, I think are extremely important that people should really consider to utilize. On the international scale, the focus on free, prior, and informed consent, according to the United Nations Declaration of Rights for Indigenous Peoples. One example is the Arctic Passion Project that has a work package, I believe is work package 4. I'm involved with one of those projects, and I've been really amazed at how they're really focused on free, prior, and informed consent, really spending that first chunk of the project just getting to know what the local folks want and have it really locally driven. I won't talk about that now, but I'll mention it again after. And then finally, there's Indigenous entities that are really taking the initiative to, you know, take control over how folks engage locally. I think we've seen a ton of guidelines and ethical documents out there that mean well and they're coming from a good place. However, they're not really written by the locals. So I think this will bring a lot of power, especially this Inuit Circumpolar Committee, equitable and ethical engagement in Inuit communities and Indigenous knowledge. I think it's going to prove to be a very good document, and that's going to come out next year. If you look up ICC, there's a comprehensive report that pulls together all the existing ethics and guidelines out there, but however, ICC is currently working with delegates to write their own guidelines. And then I also, before I actually try to answer the question of why it's so hard to engage with, or why it's so hard to solicit locals' involvement, I also wanted to just, since today's focus is on sharing, I just wanted to reemphasize how much sharing is at the core of really who we are in the Arctic. The Inuit people that I'm part of, and I've seen that this is very similar to other Arctic cultures, is what really dawned on me is that, yes, all my life I've known that we are a sharing culture, but it really has been dawning on me more or less lately that how sharing is at the center of our culture. And that's not just a cultural trait, it's actually security and survival for thousands of years. Right when we catch an animal, for instance, our first instinct is to share with those in need, the elders and the people who need it. And if you think about that, that's a long-term survival tactic. It's a multi-generational communal dependency that's focused on sharing the resources with people in need. So it ties into our relationships in the villages as well. These are lifelong relationships, these communal dependencies on sharing these. And I really see Indigenous knowledge as a sharing network. We share information, real-time information on a daily basis about, don't go over there. For instance, it's not safe over there. Ice is not good, or travel's not good over here. But basically, we're just giving each other information within our sharing networks about safety and communal success. And on top of that, people are reluctant to just accept people and to start sharing time and space and energy with folks. So that's one thing to consider, is that there is some hesitancy, because a lot of people do kind of come in and go in our villages, and we're very used to that. And once you do enter these sharing networks, Craig George, I always use this example. He always says that he entered the sharing network in Utkagovik, and he's been living there for a long time. However, it took him a long time to really realize that he had entered it, and he was expected to share back once he was being shared information. And basically, our people in the villages are really focused on helping projects that have tangible impacts on our villages. So keep that in mind too, is if you don't have those direct relevant impacts, a lot of times people will be very reluctant to begin sharing even time and space initially. The picture here on the side is we call it Inupiaq salad or Eskimo salad. And I did a presentation called A Sharing Culture. And I was trying to think of an example of how we share, and I was just munching on some salad that night and I realized, man, this is a great example. So if you didn't see that presentation, I just want to tell you that, for instance, this one little dish right here represents our culture. This one dish alone, it's called Inupiaq salad, and it has number one beluga muktuk, which is whale blubber and muktuk that was given to me by an elder when I went to go help him move some stuff here in Anchorage. I brought him some fish and he gave me the muktuk. Banaluk, which is dried ugruk meat that was made by my mother-in-law in Shishmaref. Dungiak, which is the processed blubber, which is not quite rendered down, but it's the, and that was made in Shishmaref. The seal oil is from Shish. The smoked salmon we made in Chitna. The salmon eggs we also got in Chitna. The dried chums came from my mom in Unalakleet. The herring eggs came from another family in Unalakleet. And then all the cabbage and everything came from the store. So you could imagine that all those different things across the whole state of Alaska went into making this one dish. And it was just right there in front of me when I was trying to think of an idea of how do we share. So let's get back to the question that this presentation is really focused on why it's so hard to solicit buy-in from Arctic communities and Arctic research. And I'm going to avoid reading from a list from my screen. However, there will be quite a bit of information on there, and I will touch on the most important parts that I think within the time that we have. So in order to ask this question, I think we should really break it down and ask it in a different, take a step back and ask, why are we even soliciting Arctic researchers, communities' involvement in research? Is it to properly engage with folks? Is it to help them face challenges? Is it to help utilize your skills as scientists to make positive impacts on the world? Is it just to create a project or to follow guidelines, or is it simply just to receive funding? Or is it a mixture of these incentives? My observation is that it is usually a mixture of these incentives with other incentives as well. But the bottom line is that the funders are requiring this much deeper engagement. And so it is to receive funding, I think, when you look in the big picture, even though a lot of it is very well meant. So in order to answer that question, I think now that we've just established that it is to kind of, bottom line is to receive funding, how and when do we solicit Arctic communities' involvement in Arctic research? And I know this is a kind of a general process as far as funding research process. It's not exactly clear cut and it doesn't relate to every single type of the funding processes in every different country, but this is the kind of the traditional one that we had followed in the US, is that we develop idea, we distinguish a potential funding source, kind of maybe 1 and 2 kind of at the same time, maybe sometimes number 3, we develop the proposal and we try to correlate our project with the funding requirements. And for instance, the request for proposals we submit. If we don't get funding, we go back to one of the other steps. Either we go find another idea, we find another funding source, or we go back to the drawing board and kind of refine our idea. Once it's funded, you manage the grant and you do the research, and then you share the research. And that's when you do the traditional outreach stage. However, as you can see the arrow there going up, and we're really trying to bring engagement with communities bring it up in the scale. Before it was around that level 5 and 6 where you manage the grant and you share the research is when you actually engage with folks traditionally. However, we're being asked to really kind of fit it in much earlier. And then, so it kind of depends from project to project. It varies at what stage people bring it in. And I think we're really trying to shoot for number 1, bring it in when the communities or when the questions are being asked. Because some projects are based in previous projects where you got kind of input from the community and you got an idea of what they might need. Some folks are very new to Arctic research and they really don't have those connections. So it's really hard to bring folks in while you're developing an idea and you think maybe I should get this idea first and see if they like it. So it's kind of a case-by-case scenario. And I really encourage folks to try to fit it in. My observation is that it's some of the most difficult part is that we're trying to force Indigenous and local involvement into the current structures. And we might be having to adjust the process a little bit, which I think funders are starting to catch up with. So not to be a negative Nancy, but I just wanted to point out a few things, characteristics of the Arctic research process that might make it difficult to engage with folks. The process that we've seen on the previous slide, obviously, there are some aspects of that step-by-step process that make it difficult. The competitive nature of Arctic research funding can also hurt the communal, you can't just fight for just a little bit of funding, and then once that they get funding, drop your guard, and all of a sudden everybody come willy-nilly work together. Doesn't necessarily work that way. There's a very competitive nature side to it. There's stratified power structures that might make it hard for instance, the old timer PI to receive information from a young, not as established young man maybe in the village who's helping with the project, might have a dirty clothes, but maybe he learned a lot of information from his grandpa growing up, for instance. So it might be the power structures there are a little bit difficult sometimes. The temporality of funding obviously is something that we've all struggled with. I think in Arctic research, as far as developing relationships, we all know that it's very hard to develop relationships within a 3-year period for the sake of a project. And like I said, our relationships in our villages are lifelong dependencies. So we're very reluctant to just have a relationship for the sake of a project, like I said. But I don't claim that these are bad things about it, and they might even be necessary for the research process. However, it makes it pretty difficult for what we're doing. And I know that there are a ton of people working diligently to overcome some of these obstacles. So what makes community and citizen science unique? And I just wanted to make these observations because I have my own feelings about what, not just our projects are unique from other projects. I think the field of citizen science and Arctic research is different than citizen science in other areas of the world, for instance. And that's because of this large geographical and cultural gap between researchers and residents. This is an issue that we have on Arctic research on a bigger scale. However, when you're asking folks to do citizen science style projects, it could be very difficult, make it more difficult with those large gaps. And with COVID-19, it's making it a heck of a lot harder. Everything in the Arctic is extremely expensive, and this kind of can create a uneven playing field, because what you have is this extremely high cost of living with people who make very little bit of income, and they know that everybody who comes out is getting paid for their time pretty much, not directly exactly, but we know that people are out there for monetary incentives, whether it be a project or whether they be going out to get stuff, or they're going, for instance, Arctic research, we hear a lot, why didn't we hear from you from a long time? The one thing that we hear back from scientists a lot is say, well, the research funding ran out, unfortunately. Like, okay, well, we're still living. So that it creates these kind of uneven power structures, I think, sometimes in this era of expected volunteerism in Arctic research. I think we definitely moved past that, and people are expected to really pay for people's time. And I think this creates this very different sets of priorities that people have between the scientists and the local folks. And it's just really good to be aware of that. One thing that I think we all recognize, for anybody who tries to create a app or a citizen science project, or is that, okay, we want to capture local observations, local experiences, local pictures and videos, but the truth is that we're going to be battling with Facebook, because the bulk of as long as it doesn't shut down like yesterday too often, the bulk of the bandwidth in the villages goes to Facebook, and is really, really leaned on for those types of exact things, are sharing their observations, experiences with folks. So I know that that's kind of a David and Goliath analogy, because that's such a big thing, Facebook. And as we saw in Siku's example yesterday, I was really amazed. The one key statement that I heard from our keynote speaker was that local self-determination is really key to it. And I think, in my mind, I wanted to ask him, but I think if you ask Joel, maybe that might have been the catalyst to success, is when he said, I gave up being a scientist and I devoted my life to Inuit lifestyle and who we might not have to go to that level at every. We're not be able to do that on every project, but that just gives an example of what it took to really be successful in that space, and to gain people's trust. So, oops, I apologize. I didn't erase the second bullet point that's copied. So despite these challenges, like I said, there's so much to learn from. I'm pointing these out because I would rather bring awareness, and I really feel uncomfortable with pointing out these problems without providing solutions for them all. So I apologize about that, but I'm hoping that more awareness will help us all create solutions. And just, I wanted to briefly go over a few things that have to do with the context a little bit more, because I did promise in my abstract that I would talk about context a lot. First of all, to be honest, we all know that there is not a good history. There's a lot of dark parts of the history as far as local people in the Arctic's relationships with, say, governments and outside powers that be, especially with the residential schools. I think each and every one of us who are Inuit know that we're all survivors. My grandma was taken from her village, and I won't even get into that because a really sad story. So I challenge us all to do what we can in our spaces to chip away at this big behemoth of a problem, and to really find that level of respect, because that really does create the context and informs how we are engaging with villages. We're so used to people coming and going, and not, so that really kind of makes people build up a wall. So sometimes it takes a while to really gain the trust of local partners. Context is extremely different across the board, as we said in our land acknowledgement yesterday. It's very complicated in the Arctic, from village to village, to region, from country to country. We have a lot of things in common, but it's so huge. There are so many different variables. Don't dismiss the lack of internet and bandwidth. That is a huge one, because we say it all the time. Oh, they don't have internet out there in the village. I can tell you that when I was out in my village in Unalakleet for 2 weeks last month, the whole time I was like thinking, man, I can't wait to get back to Anchorage so I can get some work done, because it's so hard out there. And we could sit at our computers and watch emails all day when we have good internet, but out there it's very different. It could be very, very hard to communicate. So you have to find those different ways that people might communicate, whether it be phone calls, text. Facebook is a big one. Subsistence life keeps people so busy 24/7, always. It's like nonstop from the time you wake up to you go to bed, in order just to stay comfortable, to feed your family. A lot of times when you have the subsistence leaders, they're the leaders at the entities as well. So they might be wearing lots of different hats. I myself am a tribal member of Unalakleet, Native Village Unalakleet, and it took me a long time, and it is still taking me a long time to really engage with them. So it's not your fault that people are not responding. I know for a fact that those people are, for instance, dealing with, it's a very small staff, but they're dealing with a missing and murdered Indigenous woman project. They're dealing with another project with housing infrastructure. They're dealing with all these different meetings, and I'm asking them questions and writing an email with the low bandwidth it's a big deal for them to answer an email, because they have to wrap their head all the way around the whole issue, and then they have to answer on behalf of their people. So it takes a long time for them to do that. Sometimes it's just impossible to. And I know I'm getting 22 minutes. So this next point that I wanted to make really quickly was simply just a bullet point, but I decided to make a whole slide out of it, because it really affects how locals perceive and perceive people coming out and asking them questions, whether you be a scientist or a federal worker or anybody. When you come and approach and ask them for their input, we're so used to this notice and comment law. And I've made this, I shared this at AGU last year, so some of you may have heard this already, but we have so much federal lands in state of Alaska, and I think this is true for other parts of the Arctic, and I apologize for those that are it being so Alaska centric here. But the US population down in the lower 48, that we call it the continental lower 48, there's 326 million people with 418 million acres of land, and that breaks down to 1.3 acres per person generally per capita. When you come into Alaska, you have 730,000 people with 220 million acres of land. That breaks down to 303 acres, so roughly 250 times, almost 300 times as much. When you go out to rural Alaska and you take away the populations in Anchorage and Fairbanks and Juneau, you have 238,000 people in rural Alaska with that 220 million acres of land is pretty much all in rural Alaska. It breaks down to 931 acres of federal land per person. That's 900, almost 900 times as the people down in low 48. So we're forced to go, and every time that any of these, you see the circle down here, anytime that we have anything going on or different in these federal lands, that specific, these are all governed by different federal agencies. They're all forced to come in and do this notice and comment. Anytime they're doing anything different, projects or anything, it's the same process every single time. And they ask us to come in and provide comments for the register. And you can look at the look on their faces of these guys right here. They're getting so sick and tired of this because people go in and give their comments and they feel so passionate about it. But it's always either ignored or put on the shelf or written up in a binder and put on a shelf or put on into the federal registers. And then the feds have total control over what is done with that input. So I just wanted to reemphasize that people are getting really sick of this process throughout our whole lives. And you can see how much federal lands are in there. And then this kind of ties to how people respond to, say, a scientist who might come in and ask for their input. Because they've done this their whole lives, and it gets really, really tiring. So just very quickly, I know that I'm just up to 25 minutes, but I'm going to go over the conclusions, and then I'll hopefully have a little bit of time for questions. So I apologize that we didn't have a clear message in this presentation. I really wanted to shoot for that. I think the message would be that maybe we're asking, when we think about why engagement with people in the rural Arctic is so difficult, maybe we're asking the wrong question. That's why I wanted to ask the question in a different way. Why are we soliciting their input for the funding generally? How are we doing it? Maybe we should think and have more self-reflection on how we go about engaging folks, and maybe the research process has to be tweaked if that's the case. There are so many lessons to learn from, and there's so many successes as well. I'm so proud of being in this field of research. Utilize planning grants. I can't say that enough. Be creative and try to follow the free, prior, and informed consent process. Look it up and see how you can do it. I know that the US doesn't have that requirement right now, but you have the ability to try to get a planning grant to do that part of it, to try to go out and listen, try to work in the same area, maybe geographically, so you could have generational research so that you could build on previous relationships. Why are we soliciting people? Because like I said, maybe it's because of the funding. And we all know that the nature of a research process is competitive, very stratified power structures, temporal and rigid, that doesn't allow for too much flexibility. So this makes it difficult, but let's chip away at it and work at this as a team. Sharing, like I said, is at the core of who we are. It's at the core of why. If it wasn't for this, the core of sharing, our people would not even have our communities in the Arctic for thousands of years. I promise you that, because we would have died a long time ago and starved and everything, because we really rely. All of our origin stories talks about almost starving and going and get one seal and everybody getting a tiny piece to get through. So it's at the core of who we are. Arctic citizen sciences and community science, let's keep in mind some of those power inequities. And let's really don't have any expected volunteerism. I heard some really good examples yesterday, but unfortunately people in the Arctic don't have money to pay for their own cost of living. It's extremely high, and bandwidth is very low. So this presentation wasn't exactly relevant to everybody in the audience today. However, if you do work over in areas where there are Indigenous communities, I hope that it is able to instill some thought. And I'm really happy to take any questions. I know that I probably don't have that much time for questions, but that's my email right there. And I always love to engage with answer. I watch my email very closely. So, and I just love helping inform and helping point people in the right direction. So if you have any questions, please don't hesitate to reach out.
Thank you, Corey. We are actually going to go through quarter to the hour, so we'll have an extra few minutes for questions. I'd like to invite people to put their questions in the chat or use the raise hand function, and I will help to facilitate the Q&A session. So there's a lot of appreciation for you in the chat, Corey. But no questions yet. I maybe would start with a question for you, Corey. Because you have so much experience working both with researchers and with the schools, do you see that there is a bit of excitement from the youth to be engaged with researchers more these days? Do they feel like there's plenty of opportunities to do that moving ahead as a career, maybe?
Yes, I think there's so much potential there, because every time I go into the villages, it's the kids are not the issue. They just eat it up and they just love it. We have a crisis across rural Alaska with the retention of teachers and educators, and unfortunately, I will say, I don't want to point any fingers, but the problem that we have is dysfunction at the teaching and administrative levels. So many people are working their butts off to do this right. It's just with the COVID-19 crisis looming on people, it made the situation so much more harder to get people in and out, and the uncertainty of teaching. And then you have these huge cohorts of people who are new to the villages. Before COVID-19, we had one of the worst teacher retention problems. So my issue always is getting on the same page as the teachers when they're trying to get up to speed with village life, and what I do is I do my homework and I try to find how how outreach might correlate directly with their curriculum, and then I approach them. And you have to be careful with who you approach as well. If you start approaching the administration, for instance, principals or superintendents, it can get really long with all of the back and forth. But if you're able to find an ally in the classroom that really wants to utilize each other and help each other as a team, that's how you really get magic, is if you are able to find an ally in the schools and correlate your outreach with curriculum. That's very, very key, because the teachers will love it, because then they can kill two birds with one stone instead of having to do a whole extra thing for your outreach.
Thank you, Corey. There's questions rolling in the chat. I'm going to read them out for the live stream. The first one comes from Stanislav, who asks, how do you think is a better way of incorporating Indigenous knowledge and engaging Indigenous communities into science?
I think I wish I had a one-size-fits-all answer, but I know that every single project is unique, and you have to, I guess you have to do it your own way, I think, and figure out. I don't have an answer. What you would have to do is go, if you're working in a geographic area and you already know who you want to work with, those are the people you should be asking for guidance. And sometimes it's kind of tricky, because you go in and ask for guidance, you're asking for their time, and if it's not paid, then it's kind of this conundrum that we're having. It's like, okay, then how do I make the project first and then ask them, or kind of thing. So there's a standoffishness, I feel, because of this conundrum. In order to break that, is that you have to be vulnerable and just try to find a way to connect. I don't have a direct answer for that. I apologize, but I do say that it takes just dropping your guard and being vulnerable. A lot of times I go to AGU and I'll bump into someone who's like a young career, and they'll be like, man, I've been worrying about this for 8 months, and how do I reach out to them? I'm like, just reach out to them or something, or like, just show vulnerability, keep trying. Even if people kind of give you a kind of resistancy, sort of a little bit, that maybe that's just the way they treat everybody who come in the village, because there's so many people that try to screw them over before. So maybe you just have to get through that first, and just keep your head up and keep showing that you're there as a respectful person. And maybe you get past that first stage, and maybe then lifelong friends, maybe,
Thanks, Corey. I think you maybe have answered a couple of the questions in the chat about how early career people could engage with folks from communities, or how research teams could connect with youth in rural Alaska. Do you want to add anything at all to that?
I think for early career folks, I think it would be good to focus on one regional area and not bunch. I mean, I honestly think that's how relationships will, you kind of get this generational research to go on. And I don't know, it can be pretty difficult, but it just gotta start somewhere, and maybe find a different way, instead of being so focused on finding a partner for your science, maybe think, okay, maybe I should just try to go on a go ahead, take a if it's COVID friendly, obviously, go volunteer, help with the whale or something, and then next thing you know, like it's just growing. The things just kind of fall into place once you get those relationships.
Thanks, Corey. And a question from Diane: how do we better engage funders in the process of changing these, and how do we make this work? And maybe this could also be a question for the bigger group.
Yeah, I'm not too sure how to do that. Maybe I've noticed that, at least like the NSF side of it, that they're very open door and responsive. So just start talking. I've seen a lot of really good positive flexibility and a lot of allies over there in DC. So I think it just takes talking and figuring things out. I don't think any of us have the power to go in and change everything. I think we pointed out some issues with the structures. I know for a fact that on the DC side of it, people are trying to figure out better ways to move them forward. So that's very hopeful, but definitely hard to change unless you're a lobbyist and you have a lot of money and go and spend a lot of time in DC. Maybe that's the way you change people's minds, I guess.
Thanks, Corey. And our last question, I think I'm going to invite Sam Hunter to come off mute and ask your question.
Yes, I have a question. I'm from Northern Ontario in Canada, and I work with the province and also a few universities and a few projects with the Canadian government. I wanted to find out, with a lot of my work with science, I think it entails for future development with the science work that we do. And I wanted to find out if you experience a lot of a cookie cutter process with the work that you do up there, because a lot of times when these scientists come up to our community, they have this process already laid out, and all they really want to find out from our elders is where we go hunting, where we gather our berries, and where the grave sites are. Is it similar up there?
Yeah, I think it's almost exactly the same issue that we're having. I will say that when the situation is like that, what we have is, well, I'll say that in Alaska, it really does vary, because I worked in northern Alaska in Utqiagvik, where my mom is from, Barrow, and we have a research campus up there, and I worked there for 7 years. So we had the infrastructure. They would come and rent it out, and it would locally accepted for people to follow that process. Like you said, people in town, they don't really want to hear too much from their scientists because there's so many scientists, and just kind of do your own thing kind of thing out there. That's a very different situation, because it was okay for people to come in and do that. However, when in other areas of the state where you don't have that local infrastructure, where it's already built into every project, that's a huge issue. It's that check the box kind of outreach where, hey, Corey, can you get me into school? And they go on and take a picture with the kids, and okay, I did my thing here. It's like, it's not about making a difference locally. It's about just checking the box for the funders to satisfy the funders. That's why I say a lot of times it really is to satisfy the funding requirements. And that's unfortunate. And then the ones that really do make a positive impact are the ones that take it a step further. I think what you just said really paints a picture for the problem that we're having on a bigger scale in Arctic research, that we're all trying to figure out how to move past. However, there are still a few folks that are doing it that way, but I honestly believe that just about everybody, especially everyone in this room, is trying to think of creative, good ways to move forward that's best for the local communities. Except it's just the structures that we have, these processes that they're required to follow. Set everything in stone before you get a penny, in the proposal, even before you get the relations, follow that strictly, and plan for 8 months about what you're going to do with every single second while you're in the field. And you got to follow that exact agenda, and you get out there and you're going to follow that so strictly, kind of thing. It doesn't allow for the flexibility that is really needed, I think. And then, yeah, we do have that issue where the irrelevancy of research and the irrelevancy of outreach too, where people come in with a strong agenda I think that they know what to do. And that's not you guys. Most of you guys in the audience are the good ones. So I hope that answered your question, Sam. Koinak, for being here. It's a really honor to see you in this meeting.
Thank you so much, Corey, and for everyone for participating in the Q&A session. I'm going to let us transition to the next session in our day, and I invite Katie Spellman to take over as the session lead.
Hello, thank you so much, Corey, for setting the tone for sharing. It's a privilege when we gather, right? That we get to share, even when it's in an online space. And so this second session is focused on just sharing what we're doing. Sometimes I don't even, know what Roberta's doing on her project when it's based out of the office next to mine. And so these moments where we get to share what we're up to are pretty special. We are going to do a series of talks. Each one will be 13 minutes long. Some of these projects are brand new and some of them have been going on for a while. And we'll have a chance after each talk to be able to to ask some questions. So our first up will be collaborative research, indigenous methodologies in Arctic sciences from Stanislav at the Arctic Center in the University of Northern Iowa. Take it away.
Thank you. Thank you. Hello, everyone. My name is Stanislav, or Stas, and I'm originally from, I'm native Sakha, and originally from the Republic of Sakha-Yakutia in Siberia. And I'm talking from the native lands of Iowa, Meskwaki, and South Nations. And I'm going to share indigenous methodologies in Arctic sciences today. Next slide, please. And I will talk about decolonization of research, indigenous methodologies, and what is being indigenous scholar and indigenous knowledge and co-production of knowledge. Next slide, please. So in the Western understanding, research in general may be defined as an investigation or experiment aimed at the discovery of interpretation of facts. Research includes collecting information about a particular subject, revising accepted theories or laws in the light of new facts, and the practical application of such new or revised theories or laws. This definition implies discovery, observation, collection, investigation, description, systematization, analysis, synthesis, theorizing, and codifying by means of the language of theory, comparison, verification, checking hypotheses, and so forth. Any research project usually starts with the setting of a research problem or a research question. In relation to indigenous communities, the entire existence seems to be a problem or a question for researchers, often formulated as the Evenki problem or the Sakha question. Indigenous scholar Linda Tuhiwai-Smith argues that problematizing the indigenous is a Western obsession. Research has been used as a tool of the colonization of indigenous peoples and their territories. Looked at from the indigenous people's perspective, the term research has been linked with colonization. The way in which scientific research has been implicated in the excesses of imperialism remains a powerful, remembered history for many of the world's indigenous peoples. The quest for the decolonization of research and indeed of the human mind has recently become one of the hottest and most discussed issues of indigenous research, primarily among those who belong to the growing generation of indigenous researchers. The process of decolonization requires new, critically evaluating methodologies and new ethically and culturally acceptable approaches to the study of indigenous issues. These approaches may differ in various ways for indigenous and non-indigenous scholars. Addressing indigenous scholars, Smith emphasized that the decolonization of research methods is about centering our concepts and worldviews, and then coming to know and understand theory and research from our own perspective and for our own purposes. Our purposes are those of indigenous peoples, and our own perspectives are the indigenous approaches that allow indigenous scholars to decolonize theories, develop indigenous methodologies, and use indigenous epistemology. These approaches allow indigenous scholars to make visible what is special and needed, what is meaningful and logical in respect of indigenous people's own understanding of themselves and the world. This whole process allows indigenous research to break free from the frames of Western epistemologies, which are in most cases very different from the indigenous ones and are indeed suited to Western academic thought, but which are nevertheless foreign to indigenous ways of thinking. Next slide, please. Indigenous methodologies are alternative reflections on a research. They aim at assuring research performance in a way that it is favorable, respectful, and ethically accurate from an indigenous perspective. According to one of the definitions, indigenous methodology is a body of indigenous and theoretical approaches and methods, rules, and postulates employed by indigenous research in the study of indigenous peoples. The main aim of indigenous methodologies is to ensure that research on indigenous issues can be carried out in a more respectful, ethical, correct, sympathetic, useful, and beneficial fashion, seen from the point of view of indigenous peoples. Thus, an indigenous approach to research significantly varies from the one of non-indigenous. Next slide, please. Secondly, it's an acknowledgement of indigenous people as collaborators rather than subjects or informants, which is quite common in non-indigenous research. Thirdly, it's a designation of a research agenda based on a real and honest interest rather than funding possibilities. And finally, sharing knowledge of the past research with involved indigenous people. Next slide, please. So in my research, I partly employ indigenous methodology, but I haven't employed it consistently. However, I consider being an indigenous person and interviewing indigenous people helps to better access and understand them. First of all, speaking a common language is an ideal situation, and since differences in language may cause misunderstandings in concepts, especially in a qualitative inquiry as it deals with words. Language is key in all stages from data collection and analysis to publication. Next, please. Secondly, conducting research as an indigenous person or so-called insider enhances the depth and breadth of understanding a population that may not be accessible to a non-native scientist. Next, please. And thirdly, many indigenous communities express distrust to outsider researchers amid historical facts of distress and exploitation. This can be an obstacle to carrying out research with indigenous people. Next, please. Sometimes it is difficult to assess remote areas in the Arctic, and therefore there is a lack of scientific literature on indigenous issues. In this case, indigenous knowledge can help to complement scientific records, although it is not a body of language of knowledge in its Western understanding, but rather a continuous cognitive process gained through practice. Therefore, it is important to incorporate traditional and local knowledge and to engage Northern and indigenous communities in setting priorities, co-designing and co-producing research, and to disseminate this knowledge by ensuring access to research data and results. Indigenous knowledge may serve as an additional source of information which can provide a human perspective to scientific data. For example, indigenous communities may notice relations among winds, animal behavior, and ice conditions, which cannot be easily explained by scientific data. For example, some scholars reported more holistic and integrated snow terminology of Sami reindeer herders and it brings different perspectives of snow in comparison to the international snow classifications. Over the last years, indigenous knowledge received recognition as a useful indicator of Arctic environmental change. Indigenous cultures have an extensive knowledge base about the ecosystems, which they transfer through communication from one generation to the next. Next, please. It is necessary to co-produce knowledge with indigenous communities. This co-production may bring different perspectives of understanding various processes and issues. At times, projects are designed top-down, but co-production of knowledge, especially in social sciences, may not address issues of communities. Bottom-up design may tackle more issues on the ground. Thank you.
Thank you, Stas. Unfortunately, we have to move on to the next presentation, but I encourage everyone to ask questions. And Stas, if you have access to the chat, keep an eye out for those questions. All right, next up, we have another sharing of a project. This is Listen Up, Discovering and Researching Alaska's Soundscapes Through Community and K-12 Outreach. Erin, welcome to the conference.
Hi, thanks so much. So before I get started, I'd like to take a moment and recognize the Eklutna Dena'ina people who have been living on and taking care of the land where the Anchorage Museum is situated on for thousands of years. I'd like to take this moment to honor the ingenuity and knowledge of the Eklutna Dena'ina and all Indigenous people for their past, present, and future stewardship of the plants, animals, waters, and lands across Alaska. So we can go to the next slide. And then you'll have to hit it once. So just my presentation today is about sound. So I just want to get us all in the mindset of sound. So if you want to take a moment and think of a sound, maybe your favorite sound or your least favorite sound and what it is. And my thought there is that sounds can elicit a lot of emotion, whether it's positive or negative, whether it's nails on a chalkboard, or maybe the benefit of camping near a babbling brook or rain on your tent. We have these emotional connections to sound, and you can hit the next click. And now I want you to think of your favorite place and maybe close your eyes and imagine what that place sounds like, or a particular sound that might be represented by that place. And now I'm going to have you press the sound button and we'll listen for a moment. You can pause the sound on that. So this is a sound that we play for our students at the Anchorage Museum when we're doing soundscape programming. And I often ask them what they think they're hearing. And I get a variety of things, such as they hear some birds, but they kind of key into that crackling, popping sound. A lot of them think it's maybe a fire, maybe it's rain. And you can go to the next slide. And it's in fact barnacles. So this is a sound that we recorded in Saldovia at an extreme low tide. You can go to the next slide. And often kids didn't know what that was, but I was down presenting at the Tern Festival in Yakutat, and I played the sound, and a kid was like, "Oh, that's barnacles crackling." And it was because of their connection to their place. They knew right away what that sound was because they had experienced it. And so sound is a sense that really we often don't think we're using, but it really has this inherent way of connecting us to the place around us. You can go to the next slide and the next one after that. So I'm going to talk today about our Northern Narrative Project. So the Anchorage Museum, we created a K-12 outreach program that was looking to connect schools across the state of Alaska in a year-long study looking at Alaska's diverse and changing sonic environments through the field of soundscape ecology. So we partnered with 5 schools And those 5 schools, we are looking to represent distinct Alaskan environments, and we are looking to partner with middle to high school age students. And this was a project that was kind of housed under a broader project at the Anchorage Museum that was developing digital resources, programs, and professional development opportunities that was funded by the Hearst Foundation, the Atwood Foundation, and the Alaska Humanities Forum. You can go to the next slide. So I've talked about soundscape ecology. I just like to put out what that means. So we're looking at the scientific field of soundscape ecology that observes the composition and dynamics of sound in an environment in order to understand the relationships of organisms and natural processes in that environment. And I use the term soundscape very similar to a landscape. A soundscape is all of the sounds in a given location. And then when we're looking at soundscapes, we're kind of in that scientific realm like to categorize and order them up. So they're usually broken down into 3 prominent categories, one being biophony, or sounds made by all living things but us humans. Geophony, sounds from the earth, so our wind, our rain, and then anthrophony, us human sounds and all the things along with us like planes and airplanes or trucks and all sorts of things. You can go to the next slide. So we were wanting to partner with schools, wanting to select a diverse range of environments to do this from. And so we had to kind of think about the best way. And the reason that we wanted to partner with schools was that I'm working in the education department with the Anchorage Museum. So we have a lot of background in working with schools in the past. And we also wanted to have some reciprocity with the schools. So we were looking to create curriculum that the schools could then use after partnering with us. And so we kind of outlined areas that we'd want to go and collect sounds to represent the vast area of Alaska. And then we were limited a little bit by funding. So we had to consider some on the road system and then some that would have more extensive travel needs outside the road system. And then we wanted to reach out to people that would have interest in this. So we really relied on past partnerships and people that we had worked with before to see if we could build on those partnerships through this program instead of starting fresh in a community. And then that was how we kind of determined the scope and the site selection for the areas. You can go to the next slide. So this is kind of a representation of the different sites we recorded at. So we were up at Nuiqsut at Trapper School, with the Nenana City School, in Anchorage, in Soldotna, and in Sitka. You can go to the next slide. So just wanted to share some sounds. So we collected actually with most sites for 2 years instead of 1. So this is a picture I took from the airplane coming into Nuiqsut September 2019, our 2nd year there, to do maintenance on the recorder and connect with the school again and share what they had collected the previous year. You can go to the next slide and the slide after this. So we're going to take a moment and actually listen to some of the recordings that we had from Nuiqsut. So you can press play. And you can pause the sound there. So this is a nice clip for me because it represents kind of all of the 3 categories. We have wind, which was very prominent in Nuiqsut. We had lots of wind. We also have a ptarmigan in the background. And then we also hear some heavy machinery from working on the ice road that was right near by the school. So when we went into these classrooms to deploy these recorders, the first thing we would do was ask the students what their soundscape was made of. So it was a really wonderful learning opportunity to find out from the students what they thought we would hear. And then we deployed the recorder, and then we were able to come back the following year, play sounds that we had collected with them during the year and kind of figure out if it aligned up with what they thought they would hear or not. And so we also had the ability to compare and contrast soundscapes from around the state. So we would bring soundscapes to Nuiqsut that we recorded in Sitka. So we can go to the next slide. And the next slide. And so this is a sound that we'll hear from Sitka. You can pause it. So what we're also looking at are these spectrograms, so a visualization of sound, which was a great tool that we used. So though we're not hearing rain, we are hearing something that is very loud, similar to the, or not that we're hearing wind, we're hearing rain. So in Niwixit, we had really loud soundscapes, but it was primarily wind. In Sitka, it was primarily rain. So some differences, but some similarities. And the spectrogram allowed students to visualize the sounds that we were hearing and showcasing to them. And we can go to the next slide. So this is me setting up the equipment with the students. So one of the big parts of this project was that they would maintain, students and classes would maintain the equipment over the year. So they would have to go check on it every 3 weeks, change out the SD cards on it, and then record any data such as what the weather conditions were or changes to the site throughout the year. We can go to the next slide. This is the list of equipment that we gave each site. So we had a SM4 bioacoustic recorder from Wildlife Acoustics with an external mic. You saw it was housed in a cooler. So a lot of our sites were pretty cold locations, and something that we kind of had to problem solve with Wildlife Acoustics because the recorders weren't meant to record in such cold locations. So we problem solved by housing them in a cooler to kind of keep them a bit warmer. And then we had really large external batteries, kind of car-sized batteries that they would hook up to keep them going throughout the year. And then they had SD cards that they would change out and send us back to the museum where we would kind of download all that data, then kind of reorganize it in smaller chunks to create curriculum and send it back out to the schools. And we can go to the next slide. This is a picture of what it would look like deployed. This is at our Nenana site. So this is kind of a full system out that students would be taking care of. You can go to the next slide. So we did all of this work. We collected over 10 terabytes of data. We recorded continuously at all sites to kind of get the biggest scope of sound that we could get to make it usable for anyone that was interested in it. And so what we've done with that is not only create curriculum for those sites, but also do some work to bring some of those sounds back to the museum. So you can go to the next slide. We are a museum of art, history, culture, and science. So we use some of our art pieces like this piece here by Thomas Hill at Muir Glacier to kind of connect people to physical objects in the museum through soundscapes. You can go to the next one. We have Rockwell Kent's Fox Island. So thinking about how we can connect our senses through some of our objects. And our next one is our Alvin Amison piece here as well. And the next slide, please. So what other things that we've done with this, we created an exhibition out of the sounds that we collected from these sites. It just came down, but we also have a website up there with it. And so that was connecting artists with the raw data that we made to create kind of musical compositions out of the sites. You can go to the next slide. We also created soundscape curriculum that's available on our website, and we did teacher professional development through ASD to teach teachers how they could use soundscapes in their classroom. You can go to the next slide. Our next steps, you can go to the next slide, are creating website development where we can have our data accessible to people so they can search and listen to the sounds that we collected from all those sites. And you can go to the next slide. We're hoping to expand that to have a kind of community science component where people will actually be able to help us identify some of the sounds we're hearing in the clips to better have more information about them. We're also creating new recording sites. So we'll be deploying a recorder down in Homer with the Alaska Coastal Studies Center. And we're continuing to maintain some of our sites to have that long-term recording to see how our soundscapes are changing over time. And then hoping to expand the visibility of our work through more exhibits, planetarium shows, programs for the public and K through 12. And now I have questions, if there's any time.
You almost made it with enough time to ask questions, Erin. There are 2 in the chat here. And to be able to fit everybody in, we have to move on to the next presentation, but will you respond to those in the chat, Erin?
I absolutely will.
Okay, we got one from Sarah and one from Corey.
Thank you.
All right. Dang, we got to get better at getting it under 15 minutes. This is so hard. Oh man. All right. We have up next, Michael Kaplan with Inflatable Heritage, Innovations in Design and Instruction at Spirit Camps in Prince William Sound, Alaska. Michael, welcome.
Yo, thank you. Thank you so much. So glad to be here. Video and audio check. Can you hear me? Can you see me coming at you from my kitchen in Anchorage, Alaska?
Even in strong.
So glad and excited to share out. And I'm so pleased that you have this sort of extra category for those sorts of projects that are in between, that fall through the cracks. Like this is like community engagement doesn't always fit into authorship. In fact, it often comes into conflict with authorship. And this, what I'm going to discuss, is not mine. It's not mine at all. It's something that I've been involved with. Though I should first introduce myself, and that I am a professor on the faculty at Alaska Pacific University, where I've been on the faculty since 2008. And prior to that, if that's not enough, I was on the faculty at Sheldon Jackson College in Sitka, Alaska from 2002 to 2007. Sheldon Jackson College was a historic Alaska Native serving institution, and APU, if you're not following the news, is going through lots of changes and reasserting itself through mission and administrative structures to better serve the indigenous population. And we're looking, always welcoming and looking for partners and collaborations. So please keep us in mind for any of your initiatives. I also want to acknowledge this digital space. And I don't mean to like appropriate land acknowledgements, but I think we might be ready for that next step of technology, because this has been really refreshing for me. Being in the audience yesterday, I was really inspired. I got new heroes, and I want to participate in just about everything and become involved. And thank you so much for that. And for this opportunity to share out one aspect of my work, and about community engagement. You with it? Give me something, throw me something in the chat just so I know there's people out there. Thumbs up, I dig that. Okay, so I'm gonna use data points and this data isn't something that I generated. I'm gonna interpret some data points, and the first one is a painting, which I'm holding here, but I think we can get it on the screen if my digital assistant would so kindly. Oh, wow, look at that. Digital, I also have a link where you can buy this. You can buy this from the artist Sandra Poling. And there's just I want you to just kind of take it in, because I think that this really captures and represents. There you go. Yeah, you click on one of those and I think you'll go straight into it. There's like 6 of those. That's the one. That's it. Thank you so much. There's kind of like a couple of details of this that I want to point out that are really significant and representative of the work that I aspire to be involved in. And first of all, it's intergenerational. Like, look at that boat. There's people, there's like preschoolers, old elders, respected elders, and young adults and middle-aged folks. They're all there. And I got to say, like the preschooler, I'm so glad the preschooler is up in the bow of the Unyak, because I'm totally inclusive about the idea of research and scientists, and like everybody's a researcher and scientist to some, like it's a spectrum. And the 6-year-olds, like kindergarten age, they're kind of like my heroes in research and scientific discovery, because like just about every day is a discovery is an epiphany for them. They ask the best questions, which is the most important part of a research agenda, in my humble opinion, is living in a question. And I just like having them around on your research team is like so crucial for me. And I love having the respected elders there because they're like my model of a research administrator. Like they know when to like hush up and not say anything. They know how to provide warmth and kindness and love just by their presence and unconditional support. And they also know how to tell you when you're off track. And then like the rest of them, the rest of the people, like the kind of the young adults that are there, they're sort of like the worker bees. Now, the worker bees may sound like kind of like demeaning, you know, like they're just like, they just do the unskilled labor, and part of that, you know, is accurate, but we all know from yesterday, they're also the best pollinators, you know, the worker bees, they like, we need them. So that's right here is a picture of my research team. And I should also clarify that while I'm a professor and I've been doing that a long time, and I'm probably going to keep doing it a long time, at heart, I'm a camp counselor. And that's what I did in my youth and what I hold on to in my work. Thank you very much. Okay, we're going to move to a next data point, and that's the video. Nice, I see. Okay, here we go. This is a 3-minute and 40-second clip that was made from another, like a spirit camp that I've been involved in for.
During Culture Heritage Week, we
go for it. I'm not going to.
have over 150 volunteers and students from all over the Chugach region. They come here and learn arts and crafts of the Sugbeck people.
The young kids have to be planned and know where they came from.
We have a kindergarten level of skills to learn. Then those skills are picked up by the middle school kids.
Learning to sew is really important for not only for their like hand-eye coordination. They're young. It's just a skill that everybody should learn to know. It's very culturally relevant to learn how to sew.
There's several of the kids I've been teaching for years, and it's fun to watch them grow, and as they you know, learn from each other. When new kids come in, they teach them and show them.
I come back because it's important for the children to understand who they are, where they came from, what their traditions are, and what their culture is.
This, in fact, is one of the threads of their heritage. It's called an Onyak here in Tetitlik and Chiniga, the Chugach. It's called a Palak when you're in Cordova. That's the Eyak language. They are a skin and frame boat. This bow is made for heavy seas. As a matter of fact, the people here paddled these all the way to San Francisco and back. They're working for the Russians at Fort Ross. And a journey like that would be in the newspapers now, because that's something for an open boat.
Getting in and out of the water, playing on the water is part of the heritage. The boats that we're using are not like the Badarkas that were used in the old days. We're using contemporary plastic boats. I really just love sharing the joy, and especially for those that are new to it, to see them light up and take to being on the water.
So much of our culture has died or is dying out, such as language, other traditional practices. But I believe that subsistence is one that has stayed strong throughout the entirety of Alaska. We catch it, we dry it, we smoke it, we salt it, we pickle it, we freeze it, we jar it. You know, those are traditional practices of preserving our food for the winter.
We always have a big native foods potluck on Friday night. Fish and halibut and salmon, clams, whatever we can find, they have for the native foods potluck, so kids from all over get to try all of those different things.
The auction is one of the largest monetary contributors to our event.
Beautiful artwork gets donated. Normally the instructor will make a signature piece. Sharon Marchant came up with a great idea to have a silent auction off to the side with lower priced things that the kids can afford.
Sometimes they have auction items to donate and really showcase what they've been working on all week.
Cultural Heritage Week is pretty exciting for the community. It's evident that they're going to continue to make this happen.
Hey, thank you so much for watching that video, and maybe a call to action is if that's something that appeals to you, you could get in touch or support the Copper Mountain Foundation, which is the nonprofit that sponsors that week. And they work in collaboration. It's sort of they're a model of collaboration between a village corporation, a village nonprofit, and a school district, where they work closely with the Chugach School District. And then they invite in instructors like me. And it's very multicultural. Like I am not indigenous. Like I'm, my father's father was a war refugee from Kiev near the Ukraine. So I'm like, kind of like, I'm a wandering Jew, and every community needs one of us to take care of some like dirty work or some sort of technical things. And I'm making a joke about my heritage, which is what a defense mechanism. But I want to share with this because I see how many minutes? I got 3 minutes left. 3. Okay. Here's my next step that I'm doing. That auction, the silent auction, I bought up a bunch of the student work, and these are like, and I got kind of like permission to take these, and I'm going to replicate it. I'm going to try to replicate it for college level work, where we're going to do designs, larger designs for friction stickers to put on paddle boards, so that in the old day, Bidarkas were always built like individually, and you would use like individual measurements, like hands and such, people's hands to build customized. But now that's also not very practical because kids grow, and like as soon as you finish the boat, they probably outgrow it. So anyway, thinking of like finding ways to individualize with student original artwork and use that as graphic design so that they could peel and place on their crafts. And I'm also, here it is, like I'm really into this notion that's been already talked about of combining traditional knowledge or ancient knowledge with high tech. And these are carbon fiber Greenland paddles, which I really admire. And I'm also discovering that paddle boards, inflatable paddle boards, are fabulous for introducing Bidarkas. Bidarkas are kind of like really like adult boats, it's tough to learn, but paddle boards are really welcoming and inclusive for young kids, and they tend to be more popular. And so finding ways, and I want to eventually do and here, like I want to do an inflatable Bidarka with a double bow. Like that's I'm looking at that. It's not a practical idea, and I know like I'm already over. And thanks for listening. Peace. Thank you.
Thank you, Michael. I think we have 1 minute for questions.
Thanks again. Thanks for this digital space and this opportunity to. I always go over, like it's like that's one of my curse is like I'm a long-winded professor, and I'm used to having my audience be captive. So thank you. Thanks so much. And if anyone I want to help with that soundscape thing that was just described, and I think students would love that. I'm all into apps, like the idea of apps and decentralizing data, like all these things, like I think that they're really crucial. And also like internet access as a human right. I think that that's huge and really timely for rural Alaska and the Arctic. And so all those things, like if you got that, anyone out there like has that going on, sign me up. Thank you.
Thanks, Michael. You knew how to fill that last minute. Thanks. And Aaron, you have a lot of questions in the chat. Would you be willing to reply to everyone? Because I think everybody's interested in your responses to those questions. And don't feel pressure to write a dissertation in your responses.
I'm slowly responding. It's just taking me a minute, but yes.
Okay. I know you're trying to be thoughtful. It's hard. All right. So we have one presentation before the break, one more, and this one is Gail Ashton presenting on monitoring for marine and non-native species in the Arctic, and her friends, Gail and her friends.
Thank you for having me in amongst this session. I'm joining you from Marin County down in California, which is the unceded lands of the Coast Miwok people. And yeah, this is a collaborative effort. My colleagues Linda McCann and Gregory Ruiz have contributed, but as you'll see later on, this work involves a lot of collaborators. And really I'm trying to share work that's ongoing further south in Alaska and that we're hoping to expand into the Arctic, monitoring for marine non-native species. So why the Arctic? Why are we interested to expand up there? As everybody on this call well knows, change is happening in the Arctic, and we're all aware of the changes, but I'm going to relate them a little bit more to why that matters for marine non-native species. So in terms of environmental change, we're seeing warmer ocean temperatures during the summer, as well as warm air temperatures. Some extreme events seem to be happening every summer from nowadays, coming from the last kind of 20 to 40 years of data. And along with those temperature changes, we're also seeing a decrease in the extent as well as duration of Arctic sea ice. And Arctic sea ice is important just in terms of its presence, but also when it breaks up along the coastal surface, it's fairly impactful to the coastline there. And since a lot of non-natives establish on the coast, that change in sea ice establishment and breakup is going to have some pretty big impacts there. What does that mean for marine non-natives? Nice paper by Ware et al. Looked at a bunch of different species that are already introduced further south and looked at their increasing ability to establish both reproductively. So we've got reproductive ability on the top figures, and then like kind of full life tolerance on the bottom. And increasingly, a lot of non-natives are going to be able to establish in the Arctic, as well as, again, with the loss of the sea ice, there's a lot more habitat that's going to be available for those species. And then another study looking again at species already established further south. The number of those able to survive and encroach into the Arctic is increasing. And along with those environmental changes, we're seeing a lot of human changes as well. So the number of ships passing through the Northern Sea Route here changed, saw a massive increase up to 2014 and has continued to increase since then. Why is this? The Northeast Passage and the Northwest Passage are much shorter routes compared to the alternatives that ships go on currently, and avoid a couple of major canal transits. So it's far more affordable, economical, and increasingly safer for ships to travel by the Arctic routes. And that's both commercial vessels, but we're also seeing an increase in tourism vessels. And those will visit some different spots than the commercial vessels might. Along with that shipping activity, seeing an uptick in infrastructure, so port structures, reinforcements of shorelines, as well as potential for artificial islands for oil and gas extraction. So we're seeing a lot more artificial substrates, which again are ideal habitats for marine non-natives. A lot of non-natives are introduced on ships. So those ships traveling through may be carrying non-natives either in their ballast or on the outside on the hulls. And again, with the addition of the substrates, is kind of an ideal habitat for those non-natives as soon as they arrive. And for those that were attracted by my mention of cocktails in the abstract, I figured I needed to include a cocktail glass. So there's the non-native species cocktail being introduced into the Arctic. Why do we care? Why are non-natives a problem? Unfortunately, elsewhere in the world, where non-natives are already prevalent, they're having some fairly significant impact, whether that's through disease transmission, both to humans and native flora fauna, interaction with the native communities, through predation, competition, grazing, etc. And there are also environmental and socioeconomic impacts. So seeing native species declines or an alteration in community structure, shoreline erosion, habitat degradation, as well as aquaculture impacts. Some of the biofouling on intakes and outlets causes problems for infrastructure, again, human health. So we're seeing a lot of negative impacts elsewhere. And why are we trying to promote monitoring? Essentially, we know from elsewhere, the longer after a non-native has been introduced, the cost and the likelihood of eradication being successful goes up. So monitoring, if you can catch the species early, assuming that you haven't been able to prevent the introduction, catching it early and preventing the spread and establishment is the most effective way to reduce potential impacts. So what are we already doing elsewhere? We are supporting a monitoring network called PlateWatch. You can see these sites throughout the south and southeast of Alaska. I need to change my map, and hopefully I will increasingly need to change my map. This is a DAC over here, and we've got Red Dog Mine that just joined the network this year. My colleague Linda fronts this network, and we would love to hear from you if you would like to get involved. But as well as supporting this community to monitor for non-natives, we've also established a call-in every month, a kind of marine invasive species committee, which is largely a sharing of everybody's experience in the monitoring as well as what's going on locally. And it's kind of a sharing of local marine news throughout the Southeast and South Alaska. What the monitors do is deploy these PVC settlement panels. They're about 15 centimeters square for 3 months. Bring them in, take photographs that are uploaded to a website database. Everybody has access to that database through a password. The images are shared. It is a work in progress. We're continuing to update and improve that platform to try and give back more, as well as share folks' data. But the images allow us to kind of scan over and see if there's anything visually distinct that we think might be a non-native species, but also over time, as monitors build up their own knowledge through monitoring over time, they can actually start to notice things that they haven't seen before maybe, and are kind of circling things to us in the photograph saying, hey, is this something new? Is this something we should be concerned about? So over time, you kind of build up that sharing and that knowledge. We would love to spread this into the Arctic. Some changes that we know we're going to have to do right now, we deploy off artificial structures, so pontoons, marinas, harbors, and largely those structures aren't available in the Arctic. How are we going to deploy the panels if we go that route, as well as the 3-month soak time is not enough for animals to grow large enough for us to be able to identify them. So there's going to have to be some changes in order to use this method further north. Some other techniques we've used elsewhere. This is in St. Paul during Bering Sea Days. We went out and did some monitoring of BioBlitz, which I'll mention next, as well as some water sampling involving the community, involving the school kids that came out with us. But for water sampling, eDNA monitoring, you essentially just need a bucket to go out, scoop some water, pass it through a filter, and then you can put a preservative in there and ship it away to a lab for analysis. Where this is still in progress, collection of the samples is easy, the analysis and having the background information of what's already in the sites, therefore to be able to recognize something new is still in development, and also being able to share that data. We don't have the data yet, so it's not that we're not sharing, it's we don't have the data, but we're also working on how to share that data and information backwards as well. But because it is so simple, it is fairly promising as a monitoring mechanism in different communities. As I mentioned, a lot of the sites we try and visit and do what we call a BioBlitz, which is some combination of community outreach and involvement, as well as taxonomic expert influx. And through that sharing, the knowledge exchange goes both ways. Obviously, the community has been living there, hopefully experiencing the environment, can share some of the changes that they've noticed, as well as the taxonomic expertise. Oh, this is what you're seeing, or this is another name for what you're seeing. These are some other changes that you can keep an eye out for, and establishing that relationship going forwards. So this was in Alaska, where we had a lot of the school kids coming out to survey the shorelines and help us bring in some of the PVC panels that we had out there. And then again, all the methods that work elsewhere might not work as well in the Arctic. So also interested in hearing suggestions, ideas of other ways that we can monitor and kind of have eyes on the ground. A lot of this is built out of we're interested in supporting and sharing in the kind of monitoring responsibility, but as has been noted elsewhere, the expense and just reality of visiting all these communities is not there. So having monitors on the ground that we can support is really critical. These are just some suggestions of other avenues that might work in terms of gathering that information and data. But the other thing that I want to acknowledge is if a non-native species is recognized and we start thinking about eradication, that is all going to have to come from on the ground. So supporting communities to have the mechanisms, the tools, the knowledge to be able to respond if that becomes necessary is also another piece that we would also like to develop. So there's been a large number of PlateWatch partners, and I need to add to this list, as well as funding agencies. Myself and Linda's contact details are up at the top, but also want to acknowledge that Tammy Davis is largely fronting the Marine Invasive Species Committee in Alaska, and would love to add people to that call, as well as if you notice anything suspicious, she would encourage you to call this hotline to let everybody know that possibly something suspicious may be arriving in Alaska. And with that, I will see if there are any questions.
All right, Gail, you have a little bit of time, and as Helen and Janet have told me in the private chat, we actually have 5 minutes to ask questions for any of the folks that have just shared, because the drawing is not going to take the full time on the agenda. So if you are somebody that just spoke after Corey, then you can turn your camera back on. But okay, so we have for Gail, number one question was from way back up from Janet. Janet, do you want to ask your own question?
Sure. I was just curious, and I might have missed it when you were talking, Gail, about the makeup of your volunteers or citizens. Like, how many do you have in your program? And my other question was kind of with all the communities that you work with, are they from those communities, or are they just going in at certain times of the year? So just a little bit more about your volunteers.
Yeah, thanks. Anybody and everybody. We have school groups, we have teachers that lead the classes kind of year after year. We have just interested outdoor enthusiasts that are interested to go out to their docks once every 3 months and take the photos. We have forestry service. We have kind of people that can fold it in with their professional roles and duties. you name it, it spans, but in the communities, so in Alaska, the Kalangan tribe are stationed there and involved in the monitoring every 3 months. Sitka, it's more of an advisory role there. The school largely runs the monitoring, so it's really across the board, and largely we find somebody that's interested in the location, and it kind of works both ways. We reach out to the community as well as folks hearing about the network and saying, hey, I've potentially got a dock and would like to start doing this. We provide all the materials and stuff. Sometimes the weights, we use bricks to sink the PVC panels, so sometimes those are sourced in location, but then kind of linked into that phone call network. The sharing increases, and as folks are interested in new non-natives, so with the European green crab, it's kind of a hot topic in Southeast Alaska now. So let's talk about getting traps out to the different sites and who's involved, who's interested to put out traps, where are the traps coming from, how can we support each other to kind of be a shared monitoring network.
Thanks, Gail. I'm going to combine a question that I asked with the question that Nelta Edwards is asking. And number one, can you give some examples? I know there's some examples in Sitka of things that have been found through Plate Watch, and then where do you think that the highest risk points are in the Arctic in general, or Alaska, however you feel capable of answering?
Yep. So I watched one of the online talks yesterday, I think it was Audrey, which mentioned Didenum vexillum. There we go. Beautiful. Thank you. Which was, identified during the BioBlitz in Sitka, as well as there's a bryozoan, a moss-like animal that was introduced in Ketchikan, again recognized through, I think they were both recognized through the BioBlitz, so the kind of intense monitoring effort alongside the Plate Watch, but the two kind of go hand in hand. Again, that injection of enthusiasm and local knowledge and awareness kind of through the BioBlitz fuels the knowledge to support the Plate Watch program. And in terms of likely arrival spots, unfortunately, anywhere that's being developed, my alarm bells are looking towards Prudhoe Bay, just because I know there's a lot of artificial structures being established there, which will bring with it shipping, but also just watching the tourism industry and where those ships are starting to come in. Unfortunately, anywhere with a ship coming in rings bells for me.
All right, thank you, Gail. Erin, if you're exhausted from typing answers, is there any that you would like to answer verbally?
I think I got them all in the chat, but yeah, I don't know if anyone needed any more clarification.
All right, what was your the one that you thought was the most challenging to answer?
I guess, what are we doing with all of it and how we identify sounds? Yeah, we have a ton of data and it's been kind of overwhelming. I did put an internship posting in there. We do have interns that help us. And I think that's something that we are learning a lot about, is data management through all of this. And really, I'd love a computer to do it all for me, but it really comes down to your own knowledge and other people's knowledge of the place is how we've best been able to identify the sounds of the different locations.
Thanks, Erin. It looks like I saw Veronica Padula wrote St. Paul Island loves Plate Watch. But Veronica, is there any project that hasn't had a St. Paul dot on the map yet that's been presented? St. Paul, there's been a dot on every program's map in St. Paul. So what don't you love, Veronica? All right. Any other questions? Yeah, I knew it. You love all of it. All right, I'm going to turn it over to Roberta, and she'll take us into the break.
Thank you, Katie. Hi, everyone. And thank you to all of our speakers who started us off for our second day. Now we'll head into the break, but before we do that, I have a couple of things to mention. After the break, we'll continue listening to these awesome 13-minute talks on our session 2 theme of just sharing. So we'll continue with those after the break. We also have a door prize winner to announce. Let's see, virtual drum roll, please. Dana Brown is our second door prize winner.
Dana! Woo!
So Dana, Janet Warburton will be getting in touch with you for you to select your prize. But now we'll go ahead and take a break. And I think we'll come back at 10:30 a.m. Alaska time. Don't forget to take a look at those pre-recorded talks in the YouTube links for the second day. And if you could also leave your Zoom on during the break, if your internet allows, that would be great. But all right, so we'll see you guys here back in a few.
Thank you. Hope everybody had a great break. We are going to continue with our presentations in this next, I don't know, hour and a half or 2 hours that we have with you all. I'm going to turn this over to our session chair, Katie Spillman.
All right, this is the same as before the break. We're sharing, we have this really special opportunity to make time to talk to each other and share what we're doing. I'm really happy to introduce, and same format, 13 minutes, a few minutes for questions. If you make it under the time limit with the magic chime. First speaker up is Melissa Ward-Jones. She's already got her camera engaged. And she's going to be talking about her brand new project with farmers, permafrost grown.
Thanks, Katie. You can hear me okay? Okay, great. Yes, hi. Thanks everyone for attending my talk. I'd like to just take a moment to acknowledge my co-authors, both the research team from the University of Alaska Fairbanks, or UAF, the Melikov Institute in Yakutsk, Russia, and as well as some of our farmer collaborators within our research project. Next slide, please. And so I'm starting my presentations with images of corn. So this was sweet corn that was grown in Fairbanks, Alaska this past summer as part of the UAF variety trials. And usually when you think of corn, you do not think of Fairbanks. You probably think of like Iowa or something. Next slide, please. And so corn, sweet corn specifically, is an example of a crop that has benefited from climate warming. And so it was a crop that we weren't able to grow at all in Fairbanks. And about 10 years ago, it was a marginal crop. So much so that in 2012, the Anchorage Daily News published an article with the headline, "Rare Successful Alaska Corn Harvest Gives Fairbanks Farmers Hope." Now, through kind of the vegetable variety trials and climate warming, it is much easier to grow corn in Fairbanks. Next slide, please. And so the graph here, here's an example kind of showing this climate warming benefiting sweet corn. So sweet corn will only grow at temperatures at or above 10 degrees Celsius. And so the annual growing degree days, this is the mean daily temperature at 10 degrees or greater, kind of summed together to give an annual value. And as you can see, it has increased a lot between 1930 and 2020. It increased something like 750 growing degree days. Next slide. And so kind of within these high latitude areas, although climate change might be benefiting crops, it's also kind of causing permafrost degradation. And so if you have permafrost in your farm field, this might lead to field abandonment. So here's an image of a field that is part of our study. It was cleared in 2000. Signs of permafrost degradation began to appear in 2014, and this field was abandoned in 2019. Next slide. And so, but actually, kind of permafrost degradation and potential field abandonment has always been a part of the agricultural history in Fairbanks. So here's kind of two kind of historical images. The image on the left was a field that was cleared in approximately 1908. Signs of permafrost degradation began to appear about 1910. So that's kind of like the darker kind of black kind of circles in the image. That's standing water, and that arose from ground ice melt. The image on the right is actually the potato fields on the University of Alaska campus. So this was cleared in 1908. Signs of degradation, that bumpy topography, started to appear in 1918, and this field was abandoned in 1927. And it was mostly because it was damaging the farm equipment too much, and it was like getting too expensive, so they abandoned the field. And now after the field was abandoned, the trees came back, and kind of the leftmost image, that's a picture of myself and my family going for a walk in what's now the bicycle bump trail on campus. So although the trees have come back, these topographic changes are still present today. Next slide. And so kind of the permafrost conditions kind of responsible for this are called ice wedges. These are the most common type of ground ice located all over the Arctic. Next slide. And then it caused that bumpy topography. Here are some examples of ground ice exposures in the Krell permafrost tunnel, also in Fairbanks, Alaska. You can see each ice wedge exposure has a person per scale. And so this isn't a significant amount of ground ice that's able to accumulate. And if you have this in your field, you really have the potential for major changes happening from permafrost degradation. Next slide, please. And so this is where Permafrost Road comes in. So we are a newly funded project funded by the National Science Foundation's Navigating the New Arctic program. Here's our research objectives. So we will kind of investigate the feedbacks and interactions of kind of permafrost and agricultural systems. We're kind of defining these systems as permafrost agroecosystems. And we'll be doing this by co-producing knowledge with farmers in Alaska and Siberia. We also want to understand and quantify the legacy effects of permafrost agroecosystems. So for example, the old potato field on UAF campus, right? The topography, its changes are still present today, but also what are the permafrost conditions? And by understanding kind of what has happened in the past, we can better estimate and anticipate changes in the future. We also want to evaluate the socioeconomic trade-offs and provide decision tools related to intensification of permafrost agroecosystems. So by working directly with our farmers, one of our big outputs that we have planned is together develop strategies to both mitigate and try to prevent permafrost loss within farm fields, but also taking the economics of it. So developing strategies that are both kind of economically feasible for farmers and kind of realistic. So taking that into consideration. And so we want to develop this guide kind of strategies that people can use, and also kind of ways to identify kind of permafrost in their fields. And then we also have a big kind of outreach component with our project. We have a variety of activities planned. Some examples, for example, at the local farmers market in Fairbanks, we'll have a permafrost grown market day, where we'll have a booth set up with our researchers so we can kind of answer questions and kind of talk to farmers or anybody who really wants to learn more about this. And also, if you live or will be visiting Fairbanks, you'll be seeing new interpretive signs on the walking trails, both on UAF campus and at Creamer's Wildlife Refuge. Next slide, please. And so our field sites, so we have field sites with farms that do a variety of things. So we have farms that just do annual crop production. So these are crops that are planted and harvested in the same year. We also have peonies farms. So peonies are perennial plants. So the same plant will produce flowers year after year. And we also have farms with livestock. So livestock will interact with permafrost differently through kind of summer grazing and also snow trampling in the wintertime. And so I'm incorporating all these different agricultural activities. We'll kind of try to understand their interactions with permafrost, and we're specifically focused on in the ground farming. There's other kind of strategies for farming in high latitude areas such as raised beds and like greenhouses and high tunnels, but we're focused specifically in the ground farming. Next slide, please. So here are the location of our field sites. So the majority of our field sites are kind of focused in the greater Fairbanks area. This is the image on the left. So the yellow dots are either farm fields or people with really big gardens. The red dots are farms that are participating within our study. And the background, the darker blue, are farm fields in permafrost areas with higher ground ice contents. And then the gray is permafrost areas with lower ground ice contents. And then within Alaska specifically, we have kind of satellite sites within Bethel, Delta Junction, and Anatuvic Pass in Alaska. We're also establishing the first community garden at Tulip Field Station. And we are collaborating with the Melikov Institute in Yakutsk, Russia. So we're doing a knowledge exchange. So This part of Siberia and Alaska actually has similar permafrost types that's like this really ice-rich permafrost. And they've been farming about 200 years more than farmers in Alaska. So we'll be doing this like knowledge exchange where farmers and researchers from Alaska will visit Siberia, and then also researchers and farmers from Siberia will come to Alaska. And then if there's maybe techniques that they're doing or we're doing that the other people don't know about, we can kind of share knowledge and help hopefully improve agriculture in our respective areas. Next slide. And so just as an example of some of the fieldwork that we will be doing, kind of the upper left, we'll be having some weather stations at some of our sites. And the data from this will be uploaded real time to our project website. We'll also have various sensor networks of ground temperature, soil moisture, other things. The kind of two paired images kind of below on the left, those are drone images. So we'll be using drones to also collect data. So the image on the left is just like a regular kind of drone image. The image on the right is a normalized difference vegetation index image. And so the darker the green, the more productive and healthy vegetation is. And the red is either dead vegetation or things that are not vegetation. And so by monitoring our farm fields over time and throughout the summer season, might be able to pinpoint areas that have less productive crops. And then those can be areas that we can then pinpoint to further investigate permafrost conditions. And kind of techniques that we'll be using, for example, the image on the right is drilling for permafrost, collecting cores to measure ground ice content, and also doing geophysical data collection techniques. Next slide. And so I just kind of want to end with, I am a physical scientist who has really embraced the world of co-production of knowledge, and I'm new to it. And so during proposal development, we use kind of two main frameworks to guide our kind of proposal that was really helpful to me, and I thought I would share in case it was helpful to somebody else in the audience. The first one is the framework by Nordstrom et al. 2020. So really kind of developing a project that is context-based, pluralistic, goal-oriented, and interactive. So the context-based, this is really kind of characterizing permafrost conditions based on where our farm fields are located, also taking into account changes like in climate, as well as just the general agricultural history. Our study is pluralistic in that we have farmers from different backgrounds, various amounts of experience. We have some farmers that have been farming for decades. We have others that are relatively new. We have some that have lived in Alaska all their lives. We have some that just moved a couple of years ago, farmers of different genders. And so really kind of recognizing runs for different backgrounds that can contribute. And our study is also goal-oriented and interactive. So goal-oriented, we all want to better understand permafrost and agriculture interactions and developing strategies to try to either prevent or mitigate permafrost loss. And by doing this, we'll be interactive. So we have an annual workshop planned where researchers and our farmer collaborators will come together to go over our results from data that we collected throughout the year, and then strategize what to do next year. So one things we'll be doing is agricultural experiments based on kind of specific questions that our farmers have. By that, we kind of can do this together. And our project is kind of fortunate that the majority of the research team and also our field sites are all located in the Fairbanks area. And so this also kind of allows a high degree of interaction. Next slide. And then finally, this idea of contributory and interactional expertise. So this was from a paper that's specifically in agriculture, but it really kind of, I think, would be useful for all kind of community science and co-production kind of knowledge studies. And it's the idea of contributory knowledge and interactional kind of expertise. So just recognizing that everyone in your study has, irregardless of their background, education level, who they are, they all have knowledge to contribute to your research. And really what's key is developing interactional expertise that I think should be the responsibility of the researcher. And so this means having the communication skills, either by being able to explain your research in layman's terms, being able to communicate with children, or even learning a new language. And it's really being able to communicate with people kind of in your research to both gain knowledge from them, and then you yourself also passing on knowledge. So there was the great example in the panel discussion yesterday of one of the researchers being really great at communicating with children and how they had such great questions. And so it's really kind of developing that soft skill to interact with them. Next slide. So I hope, in case people want to further kind of look at those papers, I have them listed here. I know it was really useful for myself. We are funded by the National Science Foundation. Thank you so much for your attention. And if I have questions, I'd happily answer them. And if not, I can answer them on the chat. Thank you so much.
You have 1 minute left, Melissa, to answer a question. Dana Brown, who was our door prize winner, she asked, is permafrost loss sometimes desirable for agricultural purposes? For example, farm fields in Fairbanks located in former wildfire areas where permafrost had previously thawed.
So I don't know specifically of examples. And so we actually have a site that is very ice rich that was in, and it's like when you like think of permafrost, right, when you're like house shopping Fairbanks, right, you want to avoid like black spruce forests. And if you have kind of alder birch, that usually means there's like less permafrost or less ice rich permafrost. But they are in an alder birch forest and they have so much permafrost degradation, ground ice melt going on that's causing so many problems in their field. So sometimes it's kind of counterintuitive. It's not super obvious. And then we do have some farmers that are able to kind of clear fields and then let it be for 2 years, a couple of years for the permafrost to kind of degrade and then they farm it. But not everybody's able to do that for economic reasons. So I don't know that if people do it on purpose other than just to prepare the field. That's all I know.
All right, thanks, Melissa. And then Janet's watch is a little bit behind mine, so she's given another minute. So to ask questions. Sarah Johnson, did you want to unmute and ask your own question, Sarah? Sorry, Dana, I didn't offer that to you since we have the time.
Sure.
Okay.
Yeah. Yeah, and perhaps I missed this at the very beginning, but just what do we know through the oral history of the Indigenous folks about the viability of farming back through time? Like how far back versus, climate change and warming temperatures making it more viable now? So if you could say more about that, or that's a huge question, maybe, I don't know.
Yeah, so specific kind of an agriculture, like as we know it, farming based on my knowledge, it was really kind of originally like the Russian settlements kind of before, and then also kind of white settlements have done it. I don't specifically know specific agriculture where you're like planting stuff and growing for indigenous. It's possible that it's there, but I personally don't know that. And actually one of people we're working with Rainey Hobson out of Anativik Pass. She runs gardens in the Arctic and she has this wonderful program called the Family Farmers Program. And one of the things that she's doing, so she's growing vegetables out of her high tunnel and she provides all families like free this little garden box that she prepares for them. And just so that they're able to grow and be exposed to vegetables that aren't like part of their culture, what they normally eat, just to have exposure. And then she's also kind of developing recipes, like more traditional indigenous recipes, and then using kind of these new produce. So that's like the outreach that she's specifically doing in Anativik Pass. And she's part of this project and we're like helping support her efforts there. But that's really the only kind of example that I have kind of for this. I don't know if I really answered your question. Sorry.
Sarah, I've heard some really cool examples of cultivating berries and preserving permafrost. So I'll connect with you later if you're interested, Sarah.
Yeah.
There's one more question, and Janet's watch is a little behind mine too. So Sam Hunter, did you want to unmute and ask your own question?
Yes, I wanted. We tried farming here and the pH levels are not that great because we were once under the water after the refeeding ice age and all we have is peat and sphagnum. And do you have any information on how to grow crops with that? We're just starting next year and it'd be nice to have a head start for next year.
Yeah, this is something we can talk about maybe kind of after separately from this. So for that specifically, I don't know anything off the top of my head. I was kind of my collaborator colleague on this project, Lena Gannon, who's an agricultural kind of scientist, would be the person to ask those questions. But also this is great things that we'd want to know so that we can maybe communicate and connect and maybe kind of set up like an experiment and also try to see what we can do to improve kind of your agricultural efforts there. But I don't have an answer for you right now. because we've just started. We are technically, our start date is this winter. So unfortunately, I don't have. Thank you for sharing your email. I'll communicate with you after.
Thank you.
All right. Seems like there's a lot of good enthusiasm about this new project, Melissa. We would like to go on to the next presentation. Thank you for the questions. And this is a presentation by Jacqueline Ramsey, and it's on building a baseline for ocean acidification trends in coastal Alaskan communities. Take it away, Jacqueline.
Hi, everyone. Thank you to Arcus for holding this conference, Community and Citizen Science in the Far North, and for the opportunity to present to you today. I'm coming to you from Seward, Alaska. This is my laboratory. I'm Jacqueline Ramsey, and I'd like to first read to you a land acknowledgement from the Chugach Regional Resources Commission, of which the Alutiiq Pride Marine Institute is a division. I would like to first acknowledge the land that we occupy for our Anchorage headquarters as the traditional lands of the Dena'ina Athabascans. The Dena'ina have been stewards of this land for thousands of years, and we would like to give recognition and show our appreciation to them, their land, and to their continued stewardship. We would also like to acknowledge the space and land we utilize for our lab in Seward, and the land of our tribes as the traditional region of the Chugach people of Alaska. The Chugach people encompass the Supiaq, which translates to like a real person, and Alutiiq people who have lived and continue to live off the coastal land and waters of the Gulf of Alaska, Prince William Sound, Lower Cook Inlet, and Resurrection Bay for thousands of years. We want to acknowledge our land and water, which brings us life and culture, and our tribes who maintain our relationship with the land. These include Cordova, the native village of Yak, Nanwalek, Nukchik, Port Graham, Seward, and the Katuchik native tribe, Tutitlik, the Valdez native tribe, and the purpose of this statement is for acknowledgement, appreciation, and respect for our land, waters, and people. Thank you. So as I mentioned, I'm Jacqueline Ramsey with the Alutiiq Pride Marine Institute. We've recently rebranded from the Alutiiq Pride Shellfish Hatchery. We're the only shellfish hatchery in Alaska. We've been here for a long time, originally through EVO's oil spill funding. We've expanded over the years. I've been with the Shellfish Hatchery, now the Marine Institute, for approximately 10 years now, and we've expanded to do baseline water quality monitoring. Next slide, please. This is our community. On the upper left, you will see the Resurrection Bay and Seward proper. The red dot denotes where our hatchery is. And then the middle picture shows some of our samplers from Port Graham, Nanwalek, Eyak over here, and down here is Seldovia. We also have other sites that we service in Valdez and Tutitlik and Chiniga. We're trying to bring on water samplers in these areas. I'll talk about that a little bit later. As my title states, this program seeks to monitor sites for baseline data. This began when hatcheries in Washington and Oregon noticed larval failures in their oysters and determined that their water chemistry was the problem. In Washington and Oregon, they faced different situations than we do here in Alaska. They were particularly facing issues with their chemistry due to upwelling of colder waters in their coastal hatcheries. And the problem with temperatures and salinity and dissolved inorganic carbon chemistry profiles allowed them to try and reach out to the research community, which they have a large research community in Oregon and Washington with PMEL and NOAA and all of the shellfish hatcheries in that area. So we were approached in 2012, 2013 to find out if we were seeing these larval failures in our hatchery. And we did not at that time notice anything that was wrong with our chemistry. So we began to do some collaborations with researchers from UAF, Oregon State University, and in the early stages with NOAA out of Seattle and UAF. And they approached us and wanted to find out if we would like to install a water monitoring system. Next slide, please. So the system that we installed originally was called the Sunburst system, and we have since replaced that with a percolator. I'm just going to show you here. This is in the upper left-hand corner of the slide is a picture of the percolator. This little box here is the electronic box where seawater comes in. The infrared detector can detect its water chemistry and give us continuous monitoring data, which you see in this panel here. A lot of different parameters that are being continuously monitored. As I mentioned, the newest version, the percolator, it allows us not only to continuously monitor, but also to turn off continuous monitoring and test discrete samples that are collected from offsite. With this capacity, we were able to reach out to our communities and have them establish water quality monitoring programs at their sites so that we could have possible community vulnerability to ocean acidification over time. If we didn't know it was there, we wouldn't be able to mitigate it. So we wanted to start to monitoring it. As you may or may not know, ocean acidification is due to increased carbonate minerals, or CO2 rather, going into the atmosphere from fossil fuel burning and just our being on the planet. So what we want to know is what is happening in our communities as far as the seawater is concerned with dissolved inorganic carbonate minerals, and what the availability of those minerals are to shellfish at those sites. So that's our specific goal. And monitoring in order to assess vulnerability, it can establish community involvement. And we also have some long-term offshore monitoring sites that we can integrate information from and possibly fill important data gaps that can assist management in vulnerability assays, studies, and programs to address them. In the lower right-hand side of this slide, I'm showing you a little bit of a picture of the kit that we created here at Alludic Pride with the help of our collaborators at PACI Marine Institute and Oregon State University, which is where Burke Hales is based out of. He's the one that designed this instrument. There are now 4 percolators in the state of Alaska. We have one in Kodiak, Ketchikan, Sitka, and Seward. The lab here in Seward is the oldest lab. We have serial number 2 percolator, and we've been running it continuously since about 2012, 2013, latter 2012, early 2013. And our information when we're going out live does go out to IPAC-COA and go on websites. These are sites that are ocean acidification geek sites so that we can tap onto live monitoring and find out what's going on in many different parts of the world. And you'll find our site from Allutic Pride on those live data feeds as well for continuous monitoring. We're growing as a community of OA samplers. The Marine Institute has the sites that I showed at in the earlier slide, but the other percolator sites also encompass different sites in their varying outlying areas. And so we're getting quite a map of OA community samplers in the state of Alaska. We recently expanded our baseline monitoring to a few regions that are in the north. This is all new data to me. I've been looking at data from the Kenai Peninsula area mainly, but we have just expanded our program within the last couple of years to include Kotzebue, Nome, and Utqiagvik, as well as Little Diomede. And I have to say that this new data is going to be shared with those communities, but we do have some data hurdles to get over, and that's because of the underlying conditions that are occurring in those sites. We really need a researcher to take over those sites, and we'll move into that a little bit, showing you a little bit of the data in the next slide, please. This slide, if we could just concentrate on the graph in the upper left, this is the Seldovia Village Tribe graph. Over time, oh, I'm sorry, this slide is a little bit old, and I had another slide that might have been a little better, but we'll go with this. So if you look at Seldovia Village Tribe over time, we've been sampling at that site since November of 2015, and we now have 4 years worth of data through 2019. That slide didn't make it into my presentation. I'm very sorry about that. What we see here is we're looking at sample temperature versus aragonite saturation. And I should probably back up and explain aragonite saturation a little bit to you here. When shellfish are larvae, they start to produce shell very, very early in their development, within hours to days, depending on the species. And so they need a certain form of dissolved inorganic carbon minerals to perform that activity. And aragonite, what you see here, this is called aragonite saturation, or it's denoted with the omega-aragonite. And that saturation point is thought to be best at approximately 1.5 or above. It's a unitless measure, but 1.5 and above is thought to be least deleterious for larvae when it comes to saturation state of aragonite, which is what they're the primary shell building form of carbonate is for them. So here, this is just 1 year of data in Seldovia, but I can tell you over the 4 years of data in the graph that that I have, it looks the same. Almost every year there's a peak in aragonite saturation above 1.5. Late in May starts to get really, really nice, and then it falls off in the fall. And we see this pattern over and over and over again in Seldovia. We're really interested in this area of the peninsula because we are trying to do clam garden work, and
that's the timer, the annoying timer. Sorry, Jacqueline. Do you have like one summary sentence that you'd like to close out with?
I'd just like to say that this program is expanding and we are bringing on sites all the time, and it's really important that we get a really good data set, a sample once a week, preferably the same day, the same time, for great data resolution. And I'd like to move to the last slide and say thank you very much to HackEye, to Kunalytics, AOS, the Alaska Ocean Observing System, and to Todd Sformo for supplying this nice photo of him sampling. And I can tell why he doesn't actually go out to the ice edge to get his sample. Thank you for my lab techs, Hannah Helene and Vanessa Verhey, for helping me with the samples, analyzing the samples. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Jacqueline. And so there's a call to action there, and Janet wrote for you in the chat that you're looking for people to help. So thank you, Jacqueline. Please ask questions in the chat to Jacqueline, and if there's time at the end of this session, if we're doing good like we were last time, maybe we'll get to turn our cameras back on to address it out loud. All right. Oh, thanks, Jacqueline. Next up, we have my next door neighbor at UAF, Donna Hauser, and one of my peer role models, presenting tracking changes in Arctic Alaska through a collaborative network of Indigenous observers in coastal communities. Welcome, Donna.
Well, thank you for that nice introduction, Katie. And good morning. Hello, everybody. Yep, I'm Donna Hauser from the International Arctic Research Center at the University of Alaska Fairbanks. You can go ahead to the next slide. And so I'm really fortunate and grateful to be joining you today from Fairbanks on the homelands of the Lower Tanana Dene people. And I'll be sharing perspectives from several of my co-authors who are also based at UAF, and also the words and perspectives of several Inupiaq community-based observers with our program, the Alaska Arctic Observatory and Knowledge Hub, which I will refer to as AOK periodically through the presentation today. So you can go to the next slide, please. Okay, so a brief overview of our presentation. I'll start by just giving you a little bit of context about how we define community-based observing for our program, the AOK program. I'll introduce the Alaska Arctic Observatory and Knowledge Hub, but really the majority of this presentation is going to be highlighting themes that are emerging from our observing efforts before wrapping up with a few concluding remarks about emerging opportunities and connections. Next slide. So at AOK, we are defining community-based observing in a few ways. Our coordinated community-based observing efforts are really providing an opportunity to document local environmental conditions. So, those are on a local, relatively fine spatial resolution. Through the partnerships with our Indigenous community members, observations made through AOK become rooted in an Indigenous worldview to represent local perspectives, their stewardship and kinship to the land and sea. And then I also think our program, we're really uniquely positioned because over time, these observations have become a really powerful record of changing conditions and implications for communities, which we are hoping in the future will become increasingly useful for planning and adaptation planning in communities. Next slide. Okay, so let me introduce you to the AAOKH program, or AOK for short. It's a really large project, but ultimately the key component is focused on our network of local observers from communities across the Chukchi and Beaufort coasts of northern Alaska. Local observers lead traditional Inupiaq ways of life based on the land and the sea. And as part of AOK, observers are documenting near daily observations of local ocean conditions, sea ice conditions, weather, wind, as well as fish and wildlife observations. Next slide. So AOK is an ongoing project. This originally evolved out of a previous effort that was called the Seasonal Ice Zone Observing Network. That started in 2006. And so we're collectively building on those SeismoNet observations, with AOK starting officially in 2015. And in total, there have been over 9,000 local observations stored within our shared archives. And AOK is really representing a diverse set of observations and observing protocols. This diagram is just giving you a sampler Again, the cornerstone of the project are these descriptive local observations by Inupiaq observers. And so they're providing these sustained and holistic year-round community-based observations. But in addition to those narrative observations, there are several sort of special projects that can address specific interests for a given community. So for example, you can see we have that could include things like ocean measurements taken with a CTD instrument. We've been doing long-term mapping of the trails that are used by whalers in Utqiagvik during their spring whaling. And I think that you can also learn more about some of this from Roberta Turok Glenn's pre-recorded presentation that's scheduled for tomorrow. I'll also point out here on the bottom left, you can see our 5 current communities. They span approximately 1,500 kilometers of Arctic coastal Alaska from Kotzebue to Kaktovik. Next slide. So now we're just going to pivot and spend most of our remaining time to share some examples of AOK observations and highlight a few of the themes that are coming out of our observing efforts. Next slide. Okay, so this diagram is just an example of observations and a map that summarizes, summarizes observations. This is from summer to fall 2020 and is an example from last fall's newsletter. So don't worry about reading the fine print here. I'm going to go through some specific examples on the next few slides, but I wanted to give this to you as an example of some of our research, our outreach efforts. So we send out biannual newsletters. They always include a 2-page spread like this that shows the highlights of recent observations. And our webpage there shows where you can find those old newsletters, and you can ping me if you'd like to get added to our mailing list as well. Next slide. Okay, so on this slide and the next series of slides, you can look to that Alaska map for the stars and showing which AOK communities have some of the conditions that were highlighted on the slide. And so here we'll start with spring. Spring is generally recognized in the last couple of years in 2020 and 2021 as more typical of what sort of historic or past conditions might have been. And that's in particular in comparison to 2018 and 2019 springs. And that has translated into pretty successful marine mammal harvests for several communities. Like this observation from Guy Omnick in Point Hope. He said, "What an awesome past few days here. My captains caught the first whale. I harpooned the whale on April 22nd. Point Hope caught another whale yesterday, May 2nd. That brings the total to 11. And this is actually an example from 2020, although similar conditions were experienced in Point Hope in 2021 spring. So in 2020, they actually caught 12 whales. So that included transferred strikes from other communities. In general, I would say that the observations from our observers for spring have been have suggested highly variable ice and ocean conditions. So making those conditions sort of the springs less predictable. So for example, thin ice is often reported, as well as big, wide open leads with lots of north winds or high winds in the spring that can affect the amount and location of open water where hunting is really focused. Next slide. For the past couple of years, we have also consistently heard from observers that the coastal plain and tundra have had low snow cover. So that can affect how well snow machines can operate, as well as safety of travel. So for example, Carla Sims-Kayatuk in Kaktovik summarizes it really well here. She says, "The snow coverage is not like it used to be. I see a lot of grass sticking above the snow. When we get a good snowfall to cover up the tundra, the winds come and blow it all away." Next slide. Places like Qikiqtarjuaq or Kotzebue have recorded record rainfall like this past summer. And Bobby Schaefer in Kotzebue really talked about that with a September observation where he said, "We had 2 storms go by back to back. They produced gobs of rain and howling winds. Rising river and creek waters will cause more erosion. South winds will bring in storm surge, and huge ocean waves will batter the beaches and cause more erosion on permafrost hills." Next slide. We often hear about lots of different traditional harvests and species. One thing that's recurring is observations about fish. And in particular, in the southern Chukchi Sea region, there has been a focus on what seems to be reports of changing fish communities, the number of the key species or abundance, and their timing. So this is an example, again, from Guy Omnick in Point Hope, who observed every year we get all of the different salmon. As of the last few years, we even get some sheefish, which are not common here. The char have been coming back earlier in recent years. And Guy also has shared, numerous photos over the last 2 years of Pacific cod that have been harvested in Point Hope, walleye pollock, and even just in August, a salmon shark that was caught in one of his friend's nets. So not common species. Bobby Schaefer and Kotzebue have also frequently noted low commercial salmon catches of chum salmon, and also a burst in pink salmon abundance. Next slide. So similar to our observers providing unique fish observations in general, I would say AOK observers are very uniquely positioned to capture the emergence of uncommon or novel species, as well as unusual observations. Here's an example just from last month from Billy Adams in Utqiagvik, sharing photos of a small bowhead whale, which had been killed by killer whales. And he said that the tongue has been taken out and bite marks are visible on the body and flukes of the bowhead whale. Killer whales target small whales for an easier kill and eat the tongues. The whale will be shared by seabirds, bears, foxes, and other marine life through the winter until only bones are left. This shows that animals do share with other species to sustain. So not a typical thing to see killer whale kills of bowhead whales, although not completely unheard of. And as you can see, Billy is also providing his perspective on sort of the ecological context of this kill, kind of a representation of what I mean by sort of a more holistic perspective that we're often getting through observations. Next slide. So we're currently in the process of synthesizing observations across each year and for each of the communities. This is an example of a draft seasonal diagram or seasonal calendar. This is actually for the community of Kaktovik. And so this process really involves vetting the information and iterating on this diagram with each observer as well as their community. But I think the value of a diagram like this is it allows us to put observations in context, as well as summarize key trends and extreme events over a year. So for example, you're seeing the sea ice cycle and the open water timing and those events on the outer circle, land-based snowpack and lagoon ice cycles in the middle circle, and then harvesting activities in the center. And so we really are seeing this as an important tool for conversations with our communities to help determine what observing goals and priorities are needed going forward. And I think this is particularly important in AOK's role as what we call a knowledge hub that's supposed to serve both communities and scientists to exchange information. And a lot of that information exchange occurs through our Facebook page, our biannual newsletters, and annual steering group workshops. Next slide. Okay, so I think we find sustained and coordinated observations across several Alaskan communities reveal how sea ice loss and other environmental changes have really related or created documented impacts to access, availability, and health of fish and wildlife. This project is ongoing and flexible with the goal of being nimble as communities identify their interests and needs. Next slide. Okay, so I'll just end by highlighting our efforts to really create space and supportive opportunities for work, for research, for funding to UAF graduate and undergraduate Alaska Native students. And here I'm just featuring our current amazing cohort of students. We have Roberta Glenn from Utqiagvik, Mick Lindley from Bethel, Kimberly Peacock from Utqiagvik. And I already see these students becoming the next generation of leaders and scientists in Arctic change investigations. And certainly we're committed to continuing to support them. Next slide. Okay, and so I'll just end here by saying I'm happy to answer questions and discuss our efforts. Please check out our website, but especially the Facebook page if you're interested in keeping updated on recent observations. And I just have one last slide to say Kainakpuk. Thank you very much. And if there's time, I'll answer questions.
The timer of doom hasn't gone off yet, Donna. I think there's time for one question. And the first one that was asked, I think, is on a lot of people's minds, Donna. We've heard from Siku, we've heard from Indigenous Sentinels Network. We all are aware of Leo and Aloka. What are the efforts to coordinate across these programs with really similar goals and platforms? And how do you, how do you think that AAOK is different or synergistic with those efforts?
Yeah, it's an excellent question. One that a lot of us are in those groups, I think, are considering. So AOK observations right now are coordinated with Aloka. So all of our observations are currently actually in an Aloka database. And we have some ongoing discussions with folks from the Indigenous Sentinels Network about potentially networking networks. I think there's lots of power and potential for those kinds of opportunities. And I think that maybe a forum like this is a really great place to help identify those, potential collaborations, and hopefully can be some dialogue that results from it too. But definitely something that I've been thinking about. And actually, one of the things with AOK going forward is, we are starting to think about what are our future priorities. And so it's an opportune time to talk about future collaborations as well.
Thanks, Donna. Janet, I still haven't heard the buzzer of doom, but according to my clock, we should move on. What do you think?
Yes, please.
Oh, there it is. Okay.
Sorry, my internet dropped. I lost Zoom for a minute right at the buzzer moment, but I'm
well,
back.
That was lucky for Donna, wasn't it? Oh my gosh. All right. So thanks so much for sharing. We're going to move on to Zoe Garbus with her Wildlife Information, Ecosystems, and Interior Alaska Crisis and Preparedness Communications. Take it away, Zoe.
Thank you very much. So as Katie said, my name is Zoe. I work in sustainability research at the George Washington University in Washington, D.C., where we are located on Nacotchtank and Piscataway lands. Next slide, please. So while we're engaged in a few different Arctic research projects, I want to present our recent work on wildfire communications in Alaska and Sweden. So our team is examining how information about wildfires is communicated to residents by responding agencies, but also in between residents. And on the slide, it's quite small, so it might be difficult to see, but we've used a storytelling approach to craft profiles that represent generalized types of information consumers. And this is based on data that we collected from focus groups that we conducted in Fairbanks and Mulatto in Alaska. And we haven't generated profiles yet for some focus groups that we conducted in northern Sweden. We've also commissioned a drawing for the last profile there furthest on the right, so that one isn't quite finished yet. But we hope that together these profiles will display the diversity of information consumers and also the diversity of concerns that different residents have, and also emphasize that outreach and wildfire communications have to take into account all these different concerns, different preferences for communication methods, and also varying levels of trust in communication sources. And this is especially important for residents who are not connected online and are reliant on radio or word of mouth for time-sensitive and crucial safety information during wildfires. But it's also very important for residents who are connected online and receive information through channels like certain social media platforms where they might be vulnerable to disinformation about real-time events and how things are developing. So generally, we found that residents in both Alaska and Sweden are not getting all of the information they want or the information they need, and they would like to be connected to a more regular and consistent information source about risk and evacuation procedures. And we're also seeing that generally more closely connected communities have higher levels of trust in social media, like using Facebook community groups to exchange information. And then we also found that there's significant local and indigenous knowledge about forest and weather conditions that isn't really adequately included in wildfire response and communication. So for example, in Jämtland in northern Sweden, we found that recreational hunters and foragers are sometimes much more knowledgeable about changing forest conditions than responders and communicators who might be working on a part-time basis. And we hope to explore this further in the next year. And I think some of the earlier presentations today gave me a lot of inspiration for how to do this in a respectful way and include those local communities. Thank you.
Thank you, Zoe. We, as you know, might have noticed by Zoe's 3-minute presentation, we're now in the lightning round of presentations, and we'll do all the lightning presentations and then be able to answer questions from these presentations after they've been presented. So we're moving on to Thomas, who will be presenting the baseline monitoring for harmful algal blooms in the Arctic.
Hi, hopefully everybody can hear me. Thanks for inviting me, and I'm very happy to be here. My name is Thomas Ferrugia. I'm the Alaska Harmful Algal Bloom Network Coordinator for the Alaska Ocean Observing System. And today I'll just touch real quick on our plan to establish a baseline monitoring program for HABs in the Arctic. So next slide. And actually, if you can click 3 times just to get the whole slide on, that'd be great. Yeah, I shouldn't have made this progressive disclosure, but thanks. So HABs are just when algae, usually microalgae, produce toxins or accumulate to densities sufficient to have a harmful effect on the environment and or the health of animals, including humans. And HABs are determined to be a top priority for Alaska. That was determined during a zoonotic disease workshop a couple of years ago. So it's of concern up here, and we should be looking at it closely. There are 2 main organisms that are of concern in Alaska. One is Alexandrium, and that's the top picture there, the little round guy. They produce a suite of toxins called saxitoxins that can lead to paralytic shellfish poisoning, where you actually get tingling sensations and then paralysis in parts of your body. And that one can lead to death in humans. There's another one, pseudonychia, which is the bottom picture, and that produces domoic acid, which has more neurological impacts, called amnesic shellfish poisoning, and that's mostly been seen in marine mammals in Alaska so far. But the Alaska HAB Network, or AHAB, was formed in 2017 to address the risks of HABs to human health and wildlife populations. And so the next slide, we'll talk about monitoring for HABs. And again, if you click a couple times, thanks. So there's long, in quotes, history, relatively long history of work and coordinated sampling effort in the Gulf of Alaska, where they've been monitoring HAB species, their presence and abundance in water samples, as well as toxins in animal tissues, specifically shellfish. But in the Arctic, there hasn't been such a wide program like that, and it's mostly been projects here and there that are starting up. And one of them is looking at offshore species of algae that could be HAB producing. That's the top map there. And another one is on toxin levels in marine mammals and birds. That's through a NECOHAB project, and that's the bottom figure there. But that's kind of more like directed research programs rather than a large scale monitoring program. There are a few areas that have started in the past year to look at HAB species on the near shore, kind of at the beginnings of a monitoring program in Nome and Little Diomede. And so what we want to do is kind of expand that. So if you could go to the last slide and click a few times, what we want to do is expand that HAB monitoring in the Arctic. And this is really essential to start a baseline time series now so that we can detect future changes of what might be coming with climate change and ocean temperatures going up. And what we need to do really is utilize the sampling strength of the communities because it's going to be hard to put instruments everywhere. So the goal is to provide support, training, funding for these communities that are interested in sampling for HAB species and toxins to complement the research efforts. And we're going to do a pilot program in 2022 aiming at 3 communities. So if anybody wants more information or to be part of this pilot program, please let me know. I can put my email in the chat. Thanks.
Thanks, Thomas. And don't sign off because we'll get you some questions at the end.
I'll be here.
All right, next up, we have Bird's Eye on Permafrost Degradation by Soraya.
Hi, everyone. Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Okay, perfect. All right, I'll start. Yeah, hello, my name is Soraya Kaiser, and I am happy to present today our newly funded project, Undercover Ice Agenten, which is German for undercover ice agents. And yes, I'm here on the behalf of the whole team. And please, the first slide. Yeah. So as probably most of you know, a central challenge in Arctic research today is the degradation of permafrost under a warming climate. Permafrost itself is ground that is frozen, or at least in 2 consecutive years. And as you can see on the map, roughly 25% of the Northern Hemisphere are underlain by permafrost that is ranging from sporadic to continuous permafrost. So please click once. Exactly. So when this permafrost degrades, it's not only impacting the ecology of the Arctic, but also it threatens Arctic settlements and industry in the Arctic. So the next slide, please. So together with the German Aerospace Center and the Heidelberg Geoinformatics Institute, the Alfred Wegener Institute wants to address these challenges in permafrost degradation and bridge this knowledge gap by combining the strength of indigenous knowledge and science. Next slide, please. So we want to work with schools in Northwest Canada, and click once, please. Provide them with photographic unmanned aerial vehicles so that they can capture changes in their environment that are of high importance to them. And simultaneously, click maybe 2 times so we have a bit more images. So simultaneously, we will be including schools in Germany as well, and connect these young citizen scientists by exchanging knowledge and talk about the challenges that Arctic communities are facing under a warming climate, and together analyze the data that has been captured by the citizen scientists in Canada. Yes, so we want to analyze the pictures that have been captured by the citizen scientists in Canada and complement it with data that we could derive from satellite images, and exchange this knowledge and analysis in a virtual classroom. Yeah, next slide, please. So this joint approach is, we want to bring the topics of climate warming and permafrost change into the classrooms, and not only into Canadian, but also German classrooms, and want to empower Indigenous research questions, so enable them to follow their own important issues. And we think that this is a nice approach to learn from each other and strengthen also the databases for science. Yeah, and then last slide, you can see the names of the teams of the team. And with these words, I conclude. And yeah, I would be happy to get some feedback from the audience, and I will leave my email address in the chat as well.
All right, thank you. We'd like to open it up for questions from any of the presenters that just did the lightning. So that would be Zoe with her wildfire communication, Thomas with the harmful algal blooms, or Soraya with the undercover agents.
I'm looking through chat. It looks like most things have been addressed on chat.
Mm-hmm. I have a question for Zoe. Zoe, you know, the focus groups are usually the start of the process. What could you talk a little bit more on where you want to go next?
Yeah, definitely. And that's something we've talked about in terms of having stronger methodology to make, be able to develop recommendations for like journalists or wildfire communicators. I think we're looking at maybe doing a few more focus groups and also supplement them with surveys so we can get more accurate information that we can match to these profiles to see, if we're building a sort of generalized profile, how does that actually match up with what the population looks like and the demographics of that population? Modeling to try and see, if a population is made up of maybe 20% of people who are primarily offline and the rest different proportions, what does that look like in terms of communications? So how do we build like a robust information and communication system that will reach all those different populations?
Neat, thanks, Zoe. All right, so for the next 45-50 minutes of today, we will be moving into a panel discussion, and this panel will be moderated by Sierra Fletcher. It will cover our opportunities to contribute to coastal biodiversity monitoring around the Arctic. So I'm gonna hand it over to Sierra to be our wonderful moderator.
Thank you, Katie. You are very big moderating shoes to fill, I have to say, after the last day and a half. And I want to congratulate the organizers on this. I was reflecting to someone earlier that I did not think it was possible that I could be enthusiastic about another remote online conference, but it's been great. And in terms of establishing a community of practice, it seems like you're off to a great start. And so hopefully the panel that we're about to do here will be interesting to those who are participating with a lens from the local level in Alaska, which will be the focus, but all the way also to the circumpolar level. And I want to just make clear for those who are still awake, if anyone and on from other countries, that this project that's about to be discussed has connections as well to organizers of coastal biodiversity monitoring and the other countries as well. So we can put people in touch with folks as necessary after this. But without further ado, I will introduce Kathy Kuhn from BOEM, who is the CBMP co-lead for the Circumpolar Biodiversity Monitoring Program of the Arctic Council. And we'll be telling you more about what that means shortly. And Taze Jones, who is with the National Park Service. And he is also the co-lead of the Coastal Biodiversity Monitoring Program that we'll be talking about. So they're both here speaking to you with their Circumpolar Biodiversity Monitoring Program hats on. And Kathy's going to introduce herself briefly and get us started. And then we have just one slide deck that Taze will go through. And my last encouragement is that people use the chat and don't hesitate to interrupt with comments or questions as we go. And we'll do our best to feed those right into the presentation. Just because there are slides up doesn't mean you can't ask or offer something. And then we certainly hope too that there'll be plenty of time after the slides are done, because we're really here to ask you for questions and get your input as much as we are here to share information. So with that, I turn it to Kathy.
Yeah, good morning, everybody. Thanks to the hosts. This has been a very interesting couple days and have been inspired by a lot of the previous talks and discussions. My name's Kathy Kuhn. I'm here in Anchorage, Alaska. I work for U.S. Department of Interior's Bureau of Ocean Energy Management. And one of the hats I wear in that role, in addition to a program manager for environmental sciences, the CBMP, the Circumpolar Biodiversity Monitoring Program for the U.S. And this is a Pan-Arctic program. And Taze is about to go into the details of Arctic Council and working groups really shortly. But as this is a virtual forum, we really do encourage you to chime in with questions. If you have a comment you'd like to put into the chat or to ask Taze or myself or Sierra questions, please feel free to interrupt us. And as a challenge right off the bat, if you are online and listening and you are part of community monitoring that does biodiversity monitoring, please just put it out there on what your program is in the chat. I know that we just received a couple really good talks, so help us engage in this virtual fora. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks. And I'll take over and introduce myself really quickly. I'm Taze Jones. I'm a coastal programs lead for the National Park Service and coastal ecologist. But again, my hat in this particular conversation is going to be really about this CBMP program and what we're looking at and trying to do to really kind of move forward. And there's been some really fantastic talks, and I definitely have people to follow up with on this. But I will go ahead and jump in and kind of explain what this CBMP is that we're talking about, and kind of go from there. So if we can jump over to the next slide. Just really our discussion today is really going to be about opportunities to contribute to coastal biodiversity monitoring around the Arctic. And I think that the first thing that I really kind of want to say before we jump into this is that this whole effort that we are going into is really a network of networks. And I know that literally that came up just a few minutes ago, a network of networks. And so that's really fantastic to hear. But we're kind of moving forward. So if we can jump forward to the next slide here. So I just I want to first start out by really telling you kind of who we are and what we're trying to achieve and where this has come from. It's not a fantastically new program. It's been around for a while. And we're kind of, but we've been in various different stages as we've moved forward. And so I'm going to talk a little bit about that, if we can move to the next slide here. So first of all, the kind of who we are, we've said this a little bit here. And so the coastal monitor, this group that I'm going to discuss is the Coastal Monitoring Group, which exists within the Circumpolar Biodiversity Monitoring Program, which is within the Conservation of Arctic Flora and Fauna Working Group for the Arctic Council. And that's a lot of words, so I'm going to make you a little picture that will hopefully help explain this a little bit more. So if we can just jump on to the next slide here. So the Arctic Council is broken down into several different monitoring programs, and they range from the Sustainable Development Working Group to the one that I'm specifically talking about, the Conservation of Arctic Flora and Fauna, and as well as emergency prevention, pollution response. There's a whole bunch of them. I've kind of put them on this slide here. So you can kind of take a look at the things that the Arctic Council is really sort of focusing on as large encompassing programs, as international working together, kind of really focused on the environment. And so if we jump forward just to the next slide here. So the Arctic Council itself is comprised of the member states, which all have territory that is in the Arctic, how we define the Arctic. And then it also consists of several permanent participants. And those permanent participants are indigenous organizations that span multiple countries. So, and I've listed them out here, the Aleut International Association, the Arctic Athabascan Council, Gwich'in Council International, Inuit Circumpolar Council, the Russian Association of Indigenous Peoples of the North, and the Sami Council. Those are all permanent participants. And those permanent participants have representatives within each one of these programs that work with the member states to try and accomplish the purposes of that particular program. So if we can jump to the next slide. So I'm going to be focused here. This is CAF, and so if I say CAF and refer to CAF, I'm really talking about the conservation of Arctic flora and fauna. So we're going to jump into CAF in this next slide and kind of really take a picture of what's going on within CAF. So they have a focus that really is about conservation of biodiversity across the Arctic. And one of the sort of flagship programs within CAF is this Circumpolar Biodiversity Monitoring Program. And it's a broad program that just recently finished its newest version of its strategic plan of how it's moving forward. So it had an old one and it just completed its new one. And this new strategic plan is really approved in May, has several goals. And one of the goals is to make CBMP, which stands for the Coastal Biodiversity Monitoring Program, an adaptive integrated monitoring program that's really kind of focused on trying to provide timely information about biodiversity and ecosystems across the Arctic. And it has various objectives and activities, and relevant to the discussion that we're having today is identifying expert networks that can support coastal biodiversity monitoring efforts, the Coastal Biodiversity Monitoring Program. And really the activity that goes along with that. So it gets very structured and very broken down. But the activities that we're really looking at is trying to invite relevant networks to participate and include regional, indigenous, citizen science networks to really kind of encompass this broader idea of network of networks, where we're really pulling people together who have the operating programs, who have the expertise, who have the information to come together and really, collectively work together to tell us what's happening and provide not just us, but, the information to the Arctic states, to the permanent participants, kind of more broadly, so we can see really what is happening across the Arctic in broader status trends and, what kind of changes are happening to Arctic biodiversity in these ecosystems. So if we can jump to the next slide. This is kind of the broader structure of what's going on. A lot of dashes and dots and lines and things. But basically within CAF, the important thing to know is that the Coastal Biodiversity Monitoring Program has 4 groups that broadly work within it. There's a terrestrial group focused really in the terrestrial systems. There's a freshwater group focused on rivers and streams and freshwater or lakes. And those are all freshwater systems. Then we have the coastal group. This is the one that I'm going to be specifically talking about. And it's one that I'm a co-lead of with Canada. And then there's a marine group. And we are really kind of steering and identifying really kind of where do these networks, how do we pull together this network of networks to really get this information together? And the coastal group is developing right now the National Expert Network. So within Alaska, but all of the different countries have a version of the National Expert Networks that they're working on developing. And so the coastal group itself has been working for several years now and finally published their actual monitoring plan in 2019, along with an implementation plan that was published in 2020. And so unfortunately, there was some minor complications that came up with that in the form of a virus that was spreading around that sort of prevented us from being able to get together in a lot of in the way that we had initially intended. So it's been slightly delayed from when the implementation plan was published to where we are in developing our expert networks now. So that's kind of really the big picture of where we're at with the biodiversity monitoring and the coastal steering group. And I kind of want to walk through a little bit of how this monitoring plan was established. So if we can jump to the next slide. What we're trying to do, and it's really a work in progress, is we're really taking this holistic approach to biodiversity monitoring, and the input that we got in the development of the plan really lent itself towards a food security lens and really building off of existing ICC food security work, and it was kind of moved forward by ICC. And if I didn't mention this before, ICC, that when I say ICC, I'm talking about the permanent participant of which is the Inuit Circumpolar Council. So I just want to be really clear about that. And so all of the countries worked together to try and put together this plan that was really focused on developing a greater connection that really went from the community level to the international level. And so that there was kind of a two-way sort of street of information. Like the communities were able to get information all the way up to the international level. And in the same way at the international level, it would be relevant to the communities. And so that's kind of the approach that we had. And to do that, that approach really needed to focus on bringing in Indigenous knowledge and building a platform that would allow us to be able to establish a co-production of knowledge that put Indigenous knowledge and some of the scientific knowledge together and really blend that. So if we can move forward to the next slide. The process that we went through really kind of, the whole process was started in about 2014 to 2015, and we had a series of expert workshops that moved forward. And we really kind of put up what would be those management questions that would be relevant on multiple different scales that would allow us to be able to really understand these ecosystems and the biodiversity that would make biodiversity monitoring relevant at the from the community to the international scale in a way that that supported making decisions and really address some of the questions that were very important. And so we broke that down into, that ultimately developed in breaking down through these workshops into coastscapes and then identifying what we'll call focal ecosystem components. And that's just what are these like key biodiversity species and that we're going to be looking at to try and understand getting all the way back up to the management questions and ultimately biodiversity and the status and trends of that in the Arctic. And that's what led into our coastal monitoring plan. And these expert meetings took place from 2016 to 2018 with a lot of other work that kind of went on in between. So if we can jump to the next slide. That really led us into really pulling in a fairly significant amount of Indigenous knowledge expertise into the meetings. And so that included individuals that had in IK knowledge from Inuit, the Aleut, and Sami groups. And we focused, our meetings really had different pieces and parts. And so throughout the entire development of the process, we had Indigenous knowledge holders and scientists kind of side by side, kind of putting in information to really help us address, even identify what are the management questions, like what models should we even be using to think about how these coastal systems are, connected. What are those important connections and biological relations in any of a different, any different kind of way that we can think of that would be most beneficial. And then we kind of broke those down. Okay, now we know what we're going to be looking at. How do we look at those? And that became the attributes and parameters. So this got into really detailed, and we had as much communication as we could, working through kind of identifying, here's what we're going to look at, here's how they break apart, and here's where we're going with that, and the different pieces and parts that we're looking at. So if we can jump to the next slide. I just want to kind of give an example of how that worked together. So we have the ICC kind of pulled together this food, and again I said we did this with a lens through food security, and so we said, all right, this is the food security sort of model that ICC has, and it's a fantastic model. And we had some of these scientific sort of recommendations of species and models that were going together. So we kind of took those two and said, where do they overlap, and what are the pieces that are going to be most relevant? And that's how they're all relevant, but which ones are the ones that are going to be the most useful in moving forward this biodiversity effort? So as we did that and kind of found where those overlaps are, if we can jump to the next slide, we ended up coming down with this idea of coastscapes, and that was really getting at the idea that you have landscapes and you have seascapes, and where they come together is really your coastscape. And these can be very, very different all the way across the Arctic. So, we have everything from fjords to rocky shores and cliffs to rapidly eroding shores and estuaries, lagoons, low gradient soft shores. And there was actually one that's not on here, and that is ice fronts. And we put and within each one of them, we kind of considered the seasonality that's associated with those. So you have this sort of summer season that changes and is very, very different as you move into the fall, and as particularly the winter and spring seasons. And so we wanted to try and capture kind of a broader understanding of even timing that went associated with each of these different coastscapes. So if we can jump forward again, we ultimately had all of this work that went together, ended up with a wonderful plan that really was in and of itself a co-production of a monitoring plan and a co-production of an implementation plan. And so as we've moved forward, we've really retained the idea that, and this has been quite a bit of effort to retain the effort, really focused, continuing to keep that food security lens as a big focus, because that continues to tie communities and managers and even industry all together. And so this is the thread that we've been trying to pull together to really focus our biodiversity monitoring. So if we can jump forward to the next slide here. So how does this actually look in practice? So we might have a biodiversity, what we'll call the focal ecosystem component, or the specific species that we may be looking at. And in this case, I'm using the example of waterfowl, and we may say that, gosh, if I'm a scientist looking at it, I'm caring about phenology, I'm caring about diversity, and if I'm an IK holder, I'm caring about harvest and accessibility, and how does that affect, like that's a big issue, a big concern. How do we include, some of these, like, if I harvest it, is it even usable? For whatever reason. I mean, we heard about harmful algal blooms. We've heard about a handful of things that it may be that what we harvest isn't usable. And so if I'm just doing a straight biodiversity monitoring, when are they showing up and are they there? I may not be addressing the really important components of, is this available for food security, and can we do this? And so we've included a lot of otherwise parameters or considerations, ways to look at our focal ecosystems that really allow us to continue to keep that food security concept, idea, and concerns kind of forefront. So if we can jump to the next slide. We wanted to include within the monitoring program that some of this indigenous knowledge is absolutely required for reporting. So it's not just that we're taking a look at that, but that we need indigenous knowledge to work together to co-produce. How do I interpret that? Well, I'm maybe not the best person to interpret these things, and it's the indigenous knowledge holders themselves that are going to be the ones who have to be right there side by side with us at every step of the way to be able to really interpret the information that's being brought in. And this starts to pull in, well, gosh, there's community science that's going on that's super valuable, in addition to some of the indigenous knowledge that's giving us a lot bigger and broader and in-depth perspective. And how do we tie all these things together? So if we can kind of jump to the next slide here. Whole process starts to say, okay, who's interpreting this information? We're pulling information, we're getting it together. We have this coastal monitoring plan for the Arctic. It's gone out to all the countries to begin their national implementation. Within the national implementation, we're establishing these national networks and these coastscape expert groups. So, we're pulling together within both the countries and then even internationally, individuals who can contribute to the information that's coming in, but can also support, helping to do these pan-Arctic assessments as we take this information and sit down side by side with, everyone there at the table, kind of going through the process of interpreting the information, bringing in the information, and then ultimately pushing that out to create this biodiversity status report. And those reports, it's not necessarily one big massive report that comes out and says, woohoo, now we're done. It's information that will come out because we're really trying to focus on these timely efforts of, let's pull this information together as best we can. We have a lot of networks that have information that's really valuable. We can pull this together and get it out so that, it's useful to a manager or useful to a community to see, what, for whatever purposes they need it for, whether it's, making a decision or whether it's understanding, like, is what we're seeing here going on everywhere. And we really have a bigger issue going on. So we can jump to the next slide. Right now, this is our monitoring group structure, and we have this partially established coastal steering group and indigenous knowledge network that within each of the countries is in the process of being established, and they're not completely established, but we're moving forward in the process. And that's where we start to get into really the title of the talk altogether, which is, what are those opportunities to contribute to coastal biodiversity monitoring around the Arctic? So we can jump forward to the next slide. So these are the next steps of what is in the implementation plan, and where, I think it's important to give you an idea of where we're going. And so we're, our number one thing right now is to establish these coastal expert networks, and, hence my, continued plea to really look at, where, what networks can we reach out to kind of pull information together and really start developing these next elements, which are the coastscapes. Just even mapping the Arctic of where these coastscapes are is a process that we want to have, people contributing. There's a lot of information there. We have, we do have a decent amount of information that we've kind of pulled together to, at least have a starting point to say, are these right? Do these make sense? Does this kind of fit with the overall picture of what we need to look at? And then kind of moving forward on what we technically call the geospatial metadata map layers, but really it's the biodiversity knowledge maps. Where is the knowledge held and who has it, and what information is relevant there? So, we're, functionally looking at, again, this pan-Arctic picture of who has information, where, how do we, bring this information in, who do we contact? And that way, even researchers that are, not a part of this, who are coming into, say they're coming into a village or they're coming into somewhere, might be able to go to these maps and say, oh, these are the people that have information on what's and on what's there. And this is the type of information that already exists. So I don't have to ask the same question of the same person, for the 14th time. And that was, a big concern that had come up as well in terms of researchers looking at certain information, but not having all the information, but it's out there and they're being asked over and over the same things. So anyway, all of that kind of pulls together, and ultimately, we want to put at least to some degree of examination, like this whole co-production effort. Let's talk about how is this moving forward? What are the steps like that we've gone through? Where are the missteps? Like, because no one's perfect. Like, we're going to make mistakes, and so where do we make those? And how can we help others who are also going down the co-production of knowledge road to how can they also benefit from the information and the efforts that we've put forward, because we really are not disappearing anytime soon. It's an ongoing process. It's an ongoing effort. We're trying to build those relationships and that, but that brings up kind of a key point. So if we can jump to the next slide, we have all these elements, we have all these plans, we have all this, implementation, but are we engaging the community networks and the tribes? So we put a lot of effort into trying to pull in Indigenous knowledge. And as we stepped back and said, wait a minute, we totally missed a huge segment of people that we need to be engaged with, and networks that we need to be engaged with. And so we really haven't gone really in depth into pulling in the community monitoring systems or efforts that are taking place yet. And we recognize this is a huge, call it a misstep, call it a failure, whatever we want to do. It's something that we need to rectify, and we need to move forward in engaging the communities, the community monitoring, the community science efforts that are taking place right now. And we need to build a communication plan that really establishes that communication with those networks, with the communities as well. Because, while we've been considering, there was sort of this recognition that we haven't been engaged with the communities specifically. And so that's where we're getting to. And that's where, maybe I feel like I'm in hot water going, oh no, I'm gonna move forward and make and pull people, pull those networks together a bit more than has happened it's not, none hasn't happened, some has happened, but it needs to be much better. And so if we can jump to the next slide, this is where we are now. We absolutely have to uphold the commitment and intent to have co-production of knowledge at the national level, but we also need to establish this U.S. coastal team that will give guidance and support in how we move forward that monitoring effort. That's that national steering group, that national network that we need to have, and in order to do that, we need to actually have really a strong team that's pulled from communities, that's pulled from the Indigenous regional organizations,
IK holders, the scientists from the research institutions and others, so that we can really kind of move this forward in a solid way that is absolutely beneficial. At least this is the US approach. And I know there are some people that are not in the US that are listening here. Each country has its own plan for its national implementation. This is the one that we're using here in the US. And this is what we're trying to do to kind of pull together and really move this effort forward, to have a strong network of networks that can get their information that they're collecting directly and make that relevant fairly quickly to, you know, the national and international levels, as well as, you know, being able to get that information to other communities that might find that information super useful, especially putting into the context of what's happening, you know, pan-arctically with other, with other resources that are there. So that's my big picture. And I know I skipped over some things, but I also, you know, yabbered away a lot. So I want to kind of, this is where I want to stop and just open it up to, you know, questions, clarifications, and throw out any opportunities that people might have that they can recommend that we work with. But also, I want to answer any questions as well. So I'm going to toss this over to Kathy and let her take over.
Yeah, well, I think I'll pause, Taze. Thank you for that presentation. I think it's always inspiring to hear the work that you're doing, you know, as part or as an aside of your day job of really pulling together better ways of knowing about our, you know, ecosystems in Alaska. And I saw a chat in there from Michael, and he said, he did a phrase that I really liked, which was holy flow charts. And, you know, hearing the conversations yesterday and today, and knowing the work that we're doing with the CBMP on trying to establish a network of networks, it would really be interesting to see if we could make such a diagram or build that community of practice a little bit stronger to get these networks of community-based monitoring, you know, I guess, seen, coordinating with each other, and then also maybe coordinating with these broader programs that are going on in the Pan-Arctic. So I guess, Michael, would you like to chime in with your specific question, or?
Maybe in the interest of time.
Yeah.
Go ahead, Michael.
Well, thank you for the invitation. I think you represented me so well. I feel like a rock star that I got pulled from the chat to engage. And yeah, I just like network of networks. Like I really love this, and I like the finish. I don't really have a question. I'm just like glad to engage. But here I do have I got a question. Came up with one while I was the notion of Pan-Arctic and like this network of networks, anticipating that it needs to be international, because that's one of the things that we get in the Arctic is, you know, the Arctic doesn't know political boundaries. And so how to do monitoring that is cooperative. Thank you. Talk more.
Well,
how to make it happen.
Yeah, I think that's a real challenge. And I think, you know, we're really trying to think about better ways, in addition to this great workshop, of how to inform, you know, how to reach out to people that aren't on the call today, or how to reach out to those different programs. And so either in the chat or verbally, or reaching out to us, we'd love to figure out what's the best way to reach a broader audience and make some of these connections. And so, you know, there's webinars, you know, there's apparently tons of meetings these days, workshops. We're really trying to think of how we could do that. So if anybody has any thoughts on that, either in the chat or verbally.
Yeah, and I agree. We've been really trying to think about communication, and it's been a really big push that we've had to really think about what are communication products that we can kind of pull together. We just finished a like a briefing kind of a thing. It's like a 2-page, like here's where we are, here's what we're up to, here's what things are looking at, so that people at least to some degree at least know who we are. And that I think is a big step. Like, okay, we know who you are and who's there, but then kind of moving forward from just a little bit of, it's hard because in the communities, oftentimes some things that we think are really great communication skills outside of some of the remote communities are not really good there. Like internet isn't always good, or, so sometimes it's like maybe a paper document is the way to go, whether it's a newsletter or whether it's just a sheet briefing paper that we can hand out. Is it going out to the community and being at meetings? That's great, and that's probably the best way. And yet at the same time, there's only so many people and so much time that can that we can put people in communities at any given point. So it's a lot of phone calls at this point, phone calls and and conversations and trying to develop this kind of a decent communication plan that really gets us, I think that starts to get us there, so that the lines of communication are open, that we can make those contacts and conversations.
I think that's great. We've been getting a couple of really good comments in the chat, and one of them is that perhaps a newsletter would be nice in terms of getting updates on what projects are doing what through the course of the year. And then Donna kind of chimed in and said, analyzing that networking of networks is amazing. Of course, it may not necessarily be simple or straightforward, and who would do that work. And so that kind of leads me to something else. Also, Janet from ARCIS said that they have a couple ways to share program updates to reach a broad audience, and they have the Witness the Arctic info and a polar education listserv. So we could really think maybe more as holistically of all this group of building this community of practice. And I guess, Tazi, I'm really thinking about some of the mapping work that you're thinking of doing as part of this project, and how maybe we could get some of these community-based monitoring groups or communities involved in that. Have you thought about ways to reach out? Are you thinking communities? And I sure know that COVID really has tampered things, because part of building a community is doing visiting and building those relationships, and Zoom is pretty flat.
Yeah, we've been in the process of trying to really hone in on that, and yeah, COVID has definitely been a challenge. And when we think like, oh gosh, we almost tried to set up a meeting to get people to have a conversation in September, and that kind of went south really quickly, just relative to what's going on. But I think there's going to be an effort to really kind of go to a handful of communities and maybe try and get some, just literally kind of lay out at some community meetings, like, this is what we're doing, this is how we're moving forward. But I'm open to any suggestions that people have, and I know that a handful of people have had their hands raised, and so it would be yeah, if you have comments to say or anything, like, put them in the chat that could help with that effort. But I think Gail has her hand raised, and I know it's been raised for a little while, and so I kind of want to hear what her question also is. Or her
with a question and a suggestion. It seems like a common shared platform where there's a lot of community projects that are already represented on this call, but we're all looking at a way to both to communicate and maintain and enhance that involvement. And I'm not sure if you saw the presentation yesterday from Siku, but a platform where it seemed to successfully create the map and the place where data could be uploaded and downloaded and shared, but you could also search for other projects of interest that are happening. I think it's Canada focused, but I think, and then, each of our miniature networks would be able to share that overarching platform with the communities, and kind of, if we had that one thing that we were all sharing, then that would feed back into that greater good as well. Just a comment suggestion.
Yeah, awesome. Thank you.
Are there other questions from the group? Sorry, I think while we have the people unmuting and speaking, that's wonderful. Anybody else? And I saw that there was a question in the chat, since I didn't hear any other questions, just about or suggestion regarding the ICC and the communication regarding outreach. Taze, do you want to talk a little bit about how you work with the permanent participants who, from the Arctic Council level, but then the ways that they might be involved in helping with some of the more local engagement?
Yeah, thanks. So really what we're doing is we actually are heavily engaged with ICC. And so we have an ongoing dialogue with ICC about how, everything that's happening, going all the way back to 2014, ICC has been engaged from the very beginning because they are a permanent participant. And so they've been instrumental in identifying IK holders to participate in the process. And I think as we move forward, they're going to also be instrumental in helping to coordinate Indigenous knowledge holders. And to some degree, I think they're going to provide, they're going to be doing some support as well with some of the communities within there. So they have a region that they focus in. And so within that region that ICC is focused in, they've been great about identifying people that we can directly work with. But again, our work so far with ICC has really been focused on Indigenous knowledge, and we haven't expanded that at the point we're at now. There's definitely a recognition that it's not just identifying IK holders and asking for their participation, but it's got to be now really kind of tying to the communities that people are living in. I'm not sure if I'm clear about the answer, but yeah, we've been working with them as closely as we can over the last however many years, that is 6 years, to try and move this forward.
So my observation from the last couple of years that we've been involved just in the coordination support role is part of the reason sometimes maybe there's not clarity is because you guys are literally making this up as you go along from the circumpolar level. And there's been a lot of shared learning and work done within the group on that process. So you're bringing Indigenous knowledge holder from Alaska together with a scientist from Norway and having conversations about everything, these things all along the step of the way. And so now as you get towards the future plans, bringing it down to the most practical level that you're able to, the most clarity you're able to get at this moment, what I'm going to put my email address in the chat there again, if anybody wants to reach out to follow up. What would you be asking of them? What might be a next step? Is there, maybe there's a chance for a meeting or, to explore further, maybe becoming part of this network that you're forming. What do you think that's going to look like?
Yeah, I think right now, my biggest ask is to try and if you can at all send information, to Sierra or myself, either way, for any suggestions that you might have in terms of, helping to move forward, or people who might be appropriate to contact for some of the community networks that are out there, so that basically we can build the network that to include all of broad community monitoring across the coastal systems. That would probably be the one. And then suggestions as to who you might recommend would be valuable. With valuable is a terrible word, I take it all back. Who would be the best people that we can or the ideas that might help us be able to really move and engage as we move forward, I think is my really terrible way of saying that. Basically, I need to know who do I contact within the networks, and do you have any suggestions about how we move forward? Because right now we are kind of making things up. It's not there. It doesn't exist already. So we've got to crowdsource, if you will, the best ideas that we can to try and move this forward. But I'm super happy that you guys have given as many suggestions and comments as you have. And I know there's some in the comments that I haven't seen yet because I haven't been looking at the comments, but thank you.
Yeah, so, well, I was just going to just say, we want you all here to help us make these better coastgate maps and knowledge maps, incorporating some of your information, perspectives, data. So again, please reach out, don't hesitate, and stay tuned. I think we'll be following up with another webinar, or maybe talking to a couple of you about this concept of a newsletter or platforms, etc.
Yeah.
Great. I think with that, we appreciate your attention and great suggestions and engagement today. And just like the sense of the timeline, this is literally just kind of getting started now. We would have said the same thing a year ago, but because of COVID, we can still say getting started now. So it's not too late. Definitely not too late. And if something occurs to you in 3 months, hey, this might make sense. Don't hesitate to reach out, because these efforts need to be done deliberately and thoughtfully, and that takes time. So that's where we're at. So I thank so much Taze and Kathy and everybody's attention today, and we'll turn it back to the organizers for the next step.
Thank you.
Right, thank you everybody. Great round of presentations. I'm going to actually turn this over to Erica, who's on our steering committee, to finish it up for the day.
All right, I hope you can hear me. Okay, the wind is gusting here on the coast of Takanu in Anchorage. It just started up pretty badly, so my internet hopefully will not freak out on me here. Welcome to the closing of day 2 of the Community and Citizen Science in the Far North Conference. I just have a couple announcements to make and a door prize to announce. And just for me personally too, Janan, thank you to Katie, thanks Janet, thanks Olivia and Corey and all the presenters and panelists today. Donna's phrase, networking of networks, and this has been passed around through everyone, is really inspiring to me. And watching you all work building and connecting and creating relationships of respect and understanding helps get me up in the morning every day. So thank you, Janan, so much for that. If you're not returning tomorrow, we'll miss you, but keep in touch. There's going to be ways to reach out to us. We've got a survey link, I think, that might have just been dropped in the chat or will be shortly. And we'd love to hear from you, or you can email, reach out to Arcus some other way. You can continue following the conference on social media using the hashtag CCSFarNorth, and on Twitter or Facebook or whichever of the least toxic choices you make out there. Make sure you check out the pre-recorded talks. There's so many great ones. There's 4 from yesterday, 4 for today on our YouTube playlist. I think that link will also be dropped here in a minute if you don't already have it. Again, we'd love to hear from you. Tomorrow at 8 a.m. Alaska time, we'll be back with Katie Spellman being our keynote, the fabulous Katie, who you saw some of today, and more details on her projects and more presenters and wonderful door prizes and more connection making. So finally, the door prize winner today I have as Christiana Hopner from Svalbard, Norway. So Janet will be contacting you to select from the options for your gift for your e-card. And Janan, thank you so much, everyone. See you around.
Thank you. Great day. Bye, everybody.